The screen flashed scarlet, and Seo Jihwan felt as if something alive had been torn from his chest. It wasn't pain. It was worse. It was emptiness. On the exchange display above his uncle's head, the numbers representing his trading rank wavered and began to plummet. 4, 3, 2, 1. TR1. The Seo family's boardroom fell silent for a second, and then cousin Inho was the first to laugh. Then a second, a third. The laughter swelled like the surf. Seo Gyung-soo sat at the head of the table and smiled that very same smile he'd had while pouring tea. Warm, honeyed, with ginger, just like his mother used to make. A minute ago, Jihwan had drunk it all. A minute ago, he was still the second-in-line heir to the Seo trading house, with a capital of 80,000 liang and 3 ships on the registry. Now he had nothing. No ships, no silver, no name. The scroll lay before him on the table, and the seal on it was still steaming. The transfer of all assets to the Seo house. His signature. His blood. He had signed it without looking because he trusted his uncle. His uncle had placed this scroll between 2 others. The iron contract with the Northern Principality on top. The trade agreement with the port of Namhae on the bottom. And in the middle. In the middle was a knife. Jihwan gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Jeonsu stood up and rolled up his sleeves. TR6 stood above TR1, and by the law of the exchange, could have ordered him to kneel right there. But his uncle didn't order him to. He did something worse. He handed him the second scroll. Appointment as manager of Haegu Port, the southern coast, the border with pirate waters, 200,000 lion in debt to the Salt Guild, 3,000 starving people, 0 ships, 0 trade routes, 0 chances. His uncle said his father had been too soft, said he'd left his nephew with too much. He said he'd fix that. He said Jihwan loved to talk about how he could build any port from scratch. Well, let him prove it. 1 year to do it. Pay back the 200,000 and settle the debt. Restore the family name. If he doesn't, the family seal will declare him dead. Literally. His heart will stop wherever he is. Cousin Inho stopped laughing and now looked at him with pity. It was worse than laughter. The doorman stepped toward Jihwan and placed a hand on his shoulder, as if he were a beggar, as if he were a vagrant being chased away from the doorstep. Jihwan didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He didn't beg. He looked at the cup he'd been drinking from. Porcelain, with a thin crack running across the entire bottom. He'd drunk from it as a child when he was sick, and his mother brought him tea in bed. His uncle had brought it out on purpose, so that Jihwan would feel safe, so that he wouldn't read the scrolls, so that he would sign. Jihwan took the cup. He drank the last drop. He placed it exactly in the center of the table, right between the scroll knife and the inkwell. And as he exhaled, he spoke so quietly that only those sitting closest could hear him. Uncle, in a year, I'll buy this hall, and I'll sell it off piece by piece. Kyung-soo blinked, just once. Then his smile returned. He waved to the doorman, and Jihwan was pushed out the door. One man was waiting in the hallway. Che Un-bo, 40 years old, a servant of his late father. Gray temples and hands the size of a chain. He was standing there with 2 bundles. One was larger. The other was very small.
All he'd managed to carry out. Un-bo looked at his master's face and asked nothing. Jihwan walked down the hallway toward the exit, past the portraits of his grandfather and great-grandfather, past the silk banners of the Seo family, past the mirror in which a 19-year-old boy was reflected with a vacant stare and empty pockets. 12 riang, all that was in his wallet. The seal had taken the rest. It was raining outside, and Sonryo smelled of wet roof tiles and smoke. The 7 Seals exchange was 3 blocks away, and the display board there had already been updated. Every merchant, every shopkeeper, every money changer in this city could enter the exchange's temple and see it. Seo Jihwan. TR1. Yesterday's heir, today's nobody. Un-bo walked half a step behind and said nothing. The silence lasted 3 blocks. On the 4th, Jihwan stopped. His eyes changed. Something flickered before his left eye, a translucent strip of numbers. He looked at a rice cart passing by. Numbers flashed above the sacks. The price of rice at the Sonryo market, the price in Namhae, the price in the capital of Hwando. An upward trend for 4 days, then a crash. Jihwan blinked, and the strip vanished.
The capital in his wallet had decreased by 1 rieng. 11. He didn't yet understand what had happened. He didn't know the name. He didn't know the rules. He didn't know the price. But somewhere deep within his skull, a foreign seal came to life. It had been waiting 200 years. And finally, it found blood. Jihwan clenched his fist and kept walking. Ahead lay the port of Haegu. 3 weeks' walk to the south. 200,000 liang in debt. 3,000 hungry mouths. And 47 days until the first payment to the Salt Guild. And in his mind lay a map he had memorized and burned half a year ago. A complete map of trade wind currents and pirate routes spanning 120 years. No guild possessed one like it. His uncle didn't know. No one knew. Jihwan walked along the wet road away from Sonryo, and for the first time that day, squinted slightly. Not because of the rain. Haegu greeted them with the stench of rot. 3 weeks of travel along washed-out roads, and here it was. The southern tip of the continent. A port without ships. A blackwood pier half submerged in the water. Warehouses with collapsed roofs. And people. 3,000 people who looked at Jihwan the way one looks at a rat that has run into a sinking boat. The village head came out first. Park Dal-Su, 60 years old. His face looked like a dried fish. He eyed the boy in a dirty travel hanbok and his sole servant carrying 2 bundles. Then he spat at his feet. The new manager, TR1. The previous one had fled in the middle of the night 3 months ago, taking the last 40 riang from the port treasury. Before him, there was another. That one had hanged himself in warehouse number 6. Park Dal-Su said he wouldn't bow, and that if the city boy wanted bows, he should first find a way to feed the fishermen who hadn't gone out to sea in 40 days. The nets are rotten. The boats are leaking. The salt used to cure the catch ran out last month. The village is surviving on seaweed and boiled roots. Jihwan listened and counted, not in his head, but with his eyes. The ribbon lit up on its own when he looked at the pier. A dilapidated pier. Repair cost, 17 lian. 3 boats on the shore. Repairs and tarring, 9 lian each. Nets. 14 lian for materials if they weave them themselves. Total, 68 lian at a minimum for the port to start breathing again. He had 11. The ribbon went dark. 10 lian in his wallet. Unbo, standing behind him, exhaled quietly. He hadn't seen the ribbon. He didn't know about it. But he saw how the owner froze for half a second and how his pupils flinched. Jihwan didn't bother to explain. He turned to the village elder and asked one thing. Where's the fish? Pak Dal-Su led him to the pier. A crate stood at the edge. Salted fish, 30 kilograms. Half of it had gone bad. The village head said this was the port's last shipment. Some visiting merchant had promised to buy it for 8 lian, but hadn't returned yet. Maybe he wouldn't come back. Maybe he'd drowned. Maybe he'd simply changed his mind about paying 8 lian for that stench. Jihwan crouched down and touched the crate. His fingers rested on the damp wood, and the world trembled. The echo of a deal. He saw it all. The fish had been caught 22 days ago. The cold waters off Cape Chunam. 6 fishermen, 2 boats. Salted on the shore with mountain salt. Not sea salt. Mountain salt. Salt from the Pukan mine. He withdrew his hand. 9 lian in his wallet. Then he activated the forecast. He didn't look at the fish. He looked at the salt in the fish. A stream of data unfolded before his eyes. Mountain salt. Today's price on the Sonryo market. 23 lian per ketan. The price in 2 days. 25. In 4 days, 47. A spike. The reason? The collapse of the Pukan mine. It hasn't happened yet. It will happen in 30 hours. The exchange will find out 2 days after the collapse.
The market will react another day after that. He has a 4-day head start. The feed went dark. 8 Leon. Jihwan stood up. His hands trembled slightly, but his face was stony. He told the foreman he was buying the fish. All of it. Pak Dal-su stared at him as if he were crazy. For 8 Leon. Jihwan said 3. Pak Dal-su replied that he wouldn't haggle with a TR1 whose hands were shaking. 8 or let him walk away. Jihwan didn't haggle. He said the fish was salted with mountain salt from Pukan, not sea salt. That mountain salt was 3 times more expensive. That the fish was rotten and would be thrown out in 2 days. But the salt would remain. He didn't want the fish. He wanted the salt from the fish.
3 Leon for the rotten stuff he'd have to deal with himself.
Pak Dal-su was silent for a long time. Then he said 4. Jihwan nodded. 4 Leon left his wallet. 4 were left. Unbo helped drag the crate to the only shed with an intact roof. That night, Jihwan lit a fire. He boiled the fish in seawater. He boiled it down. He boiled it again. He evaporated it again. The process was called reverse distillation, and every salt maker on the coast knew it. But no salt maker would have done this with rotten fish just for a handful of mountain salt, because no salt maker knew that the Pukan mine would collapse in 30 hours. Jihwan worked for 2 nights. Unbo kept stoking the fire and said nothing. By the morning of the 3rd day, they had 40 kettings of pure rock salt. White, impurity-free. The quality was no worse than mine salt. On the 2nd night, Jihwan spent another liang on the eye, 3 left in his purse. He checked the routes of the caravans heading north along the coast. He found one, Merchant Lee, a small-time middleman. Tertu. He was carrying silk to Namhae. He was passing through Haegu in 2 days. On the 4th day, the caravan arrived.
Merchant Lee turned out to be a fat man with shifty eyes who didn't want to stop in a backwater at the edge of the world. Jihwan went out to meet him with a sack of salt and offered 40 catting of rock salt at 28 liang per catting. The market price in Songryo at that time was 25. Merchant Lee laughed and said he wasn't a fool and that he could buy it cheaper in Songryo. Jihwan replied that in 2 days he wouldn't be able to. Merchant Lee stopped laughing. He asked why. Jihwan said that the Pukan mine had collapsed yesterday. The merchant turned pale. How do you know that? Jihwan remained silent. He couldn't explain it, but he could wait, and so he waited. Merchant Lee spent the night in Haegu. In the morning, a messenger arrived from Sonryo with the news. The Pukan mine had collapsed. 7 miners had died. Mountain salt shipments were suspended for 2 months. The price had already jumped to 35 ryong. Merchant Lee rushed to Jihwan and bought all 40 kettings, 30 ryong apiece. 1,200 ryong in silver were laid out on the table in the port shed. Jihwan counted them. Twice. Unbo stood by the door and watched as the boy, who 3 days ago had been nearly drowned for his debts, arranged the silver into 3 piles. First, 400 leon. Repairs to the pier and 3 boats. New nets, a month's worth of provisions. The second, 300 leon. Reserve capital, fuel for the eye. The third, 500 leon. The first installment on the debt to the Salt Guild, out of 200,000, a drop in the bucket. But the first. Pak Dal-su walked in without knocking. He saw the silver. He froze. He looked at Jihwan. On the 7th morning, the pier was still standing. The new planks still smelled of resin, and the fishermen stepped on them cautiously as if on ice. 3 boats were launched before dawn, the first catch in over 40 days. Jihwan stood on the shore and counted. Not with the eye, just the usual way. The eye cost money, and there were 700 leon. Every leon spent on site was a leon taken away from the port. The fishermen returned around noon. 14 baskets of silvery mackerel. At the market price in Haegu, that was 60 leon. Nothing. But Jihwan looked at the catch and spent 2 leon. 698. The forecast had turned around. Mackerel. The price in Haegu was 12 leon per basket. The price in Namhae was 19. In Songryo, 23.
But that wasn't the main point. The main point was the trend. In 6 days, the Wave Festival would begin in the port city of Tonghae on the east coast. Mackerel was the festival's ceremonial fish. The price in Tonghae in 6 days: 41 liang per basket. Jihwan scrolled down the feed. 696. The problem was simple. Tonghae was an 8-day sea voyage away. 6 days until the festival. There wasn't enough time if he took the standard route via Cape Chonam. But in Jihwan's mind was his great-grandfather's map. 120 years of observations. And according to this map, the southern arrow current existed between Haegu and Tonghae. A narrow corridor 30 li wide that, during the summer months, carried vessels eastward at twice the normal speed of a boat. Not a single guild knew about it. Even pirates sailed farther south. The current shortened the journey to 4 days. Jihwan called for Park Dal-su. He asked if any of the fishermen knew the way to Tonghae. The village head looked at him as if he were crazy and said that it was an 8-day voyage by sea to Tonghae, and their boats wouldn't last even 2 days. Jihwan said 4 days, not 8, and the boats would hold up if they followed the current of the southern arrow. Park Dal-su fell silent. Then he said that his grandfather had told him about some current flowing eastward. His grandfather was a drunkard. No one believed him. Jihwan replied that his grandfather had been right. He sent out 2 of the 3 boats, 8 fishermen, all 14 baskets of mackerel, salted properly this time. Sea salt. Cho Eun-bo went as the senior captain. Jihwan explained the route to him down to the smallest detail. Every turn. Every landmark on the shore. Every shoal. Eun-bo listened, memorized, and didn't ask how his master knew what not a single captain on the southern coast knew. The boats set out at dawn. Jihwan stayed behind with 1 boat and 3 fishermen, and 696 lian, which melted away every time he opened the eye. He hadn't opened it for 3 days. He was conserving it. Instead of the eye, his head was doing the work. He went around every warehouse in Haegu. 6 buildings. 4 were in ruins. 2 were still standing. Rats, mold, walls full of holes. But the walls were made of stone. Thick stone. The warehouses were 200 years old and had been built by someone who knew a thing or two about storage. Jihwan did the math. If he repaired the 2 remaining warehouses and turned them into humidity-controlled storage facilities, any merchant passing through Haegu could leave their goods in storage, instead of hauling them through pirate-infested waters at the risk of losing everything, for a fee. The idea was simple, but it required money, which they didn't have, and trust, which they had even less of. Who would leave their goods in a dump run by TR1? No one. Not yet. On the 4th day, Eun-bo returned, alive, with empty boats, and with a leather pouch containing 574 lian of silver. The mackerel had sold for 38 lian per basket, not 41 as the eye had predicted. The festival hadn't started yet, and the middlemen in Tonghae bought it at a discount, but 574 lian for fish that would have sold for 60 in Haegu, 10 times as much. The fishermen who had gone to Tonghae stood on the pier and said nothing. They didn't understand. 4 days. A journey whose course they didn't know. A city where their fish was worth its weight in gold. Park Dal-su approached Jihwan that evening. He sat down next to him on an upturned boat. He was silent for a long time. Then he asked who his grandfather was. Jihwan didn't answer. Then Dal-su asked something else. What was needed from Haegu? Jihwan said they needed manpower. 20 men to repair the warehouses, 30 for fishing, 10 for loading and unloading when the first foreign ships arrive. Dal-su said that foreign ships don't come to Haegu. Pirates are stationed at the entrance to the bay. The Black Tide clan. They take 30% of any cargo according to the maritime code, and if the cargo is small, they simply sink it. Jihwan nodded. He knew. His great-grandfather's map contained the Black Tide's routes over the past 80 years, their anchorages, their patrol schedules, their weak spots. He knew when they headed north in search of big prey. He knew when the southern entrance to the bay remained empty for 6 hours. He knew that the captain of the southern patrol was a woman whom the clan had exiled for refusing to sink a children's ship. All of this was stored in his mind, but that was for later.
Right now, he needed something else. Capital. 1,270 Leon wouldn't be enough to repair the warehouses. It wouldn't be enough for the next installment to the Salt Guild. It wouldn't be enough for anything serious. He needed a big deal. 1. Clean. The kind that would make the exchange's ticker flicker a second time. Jihwan spent 3 Leon on the eye and scanned the entire horizon. The feed unfolded from edge to edge. Goods, routes, prices, trends. He was looking for a gap, a hole in the system, a place where the buy price and the sell price diverged so much that a single deal could get him back on his feet. He found it. Raw silk from the Western Principality. There, it sold for 110 Leon per bale. In Sonrio, it cost 400. There had always been a difference, but now it had doubled because the Silk Guild had imposed a new toll for passage through its waters, and merchants were afraid to travel directly. The only safe route lay through the south, through Haegu. The ribbons went dark. 1,267 Leon. His eyes devoured the silver, and the silver was blood. But now Jihwan had an idea. Not trade, transit. Not selling goods, selling the route. The first foreign ship entered Haegu Bay on the 20th day. Jihwan had been waiting for it for 3 days. He knew that a merchant named Moon Chang-ho was raw silk from the Western Principality to Sonrio, and that the Silk Guild had posted a patrol at Cape Cheonam. His great-grandfather's map. 2 Leon for the eye to check the route. Everything added up. Merchant Moon was a small-time trader. TR2. 2 ships. 12 bales of raw silk. He was heading north along the coast when he spotted 3 sails of the Silk Guild on the horizon. He turned south. The only bay on the coast where he could take shelter. Haegu. He entered the port angry and frightened. He expected to see ruins. Instead, he saw a newly built pier. Workers on the roofs of the warehouses. Fishermen unloading their catch. And a boy in a black hanbok standing at the edge of the pier, staring at his ship as if he knew it was coming. Moon Chang-ho stepped ashore and asked where the manager was. Jihwan replied that he was looking right at him. Moon laughed. Then he saw the boy's eyes and stopped laughing. Jihwan proposed a deal. Storage of silk in a stone warehouse with humidity control. 5 liang per bale per day. Security. Fire insurance paid from his personal capital. And most importantly, a safe route through the southern waters, past the Silk Guild's patrols, all the way to Sonrio. 200 Leon for the pilotage. Half up front, half upon arrival. Moon Chang-ho remained silent. Then he said the boy was crazy. Only the black tide sails through the southern waters, and any ship would lose 30% of its cargo. Or everything. Jihwan said the black tide was heading north in 4 days. A large caravan from Namhae. The clan's entire strike force would be there. The southern passage would be empty for 6 hours. That would be enough. Moon asked how he knew the pirates' schedule. Jihwan didn't answer. He answered with something else. He activated the eye. 1 liang. He looked at Moon and saw his actual TR. Not 2. 2.5. A hidden account on the Namhae exchange. His wife owns a second ship through a frontman. She's evading taxes. Jihwan said this out loud. Moon turned pale. His legs buckled. He said that no one knew about his wife's account. Jihwan replied that now 2 people knew. But he didn't need blackmail material. He needed a client. Moon Chang-ho paid 100 riang in advance and left the silk in the warehouse. 4 days later, 2 Haegu boats escorted his ships through the southern passage. Black Pri wasn't there. Moon left for Songri and arrived without incident. The second half of the 200 liang arrived via courier a week later, with a note. 3 words. I'll be back. And he brought 2 others. Every new client paid for the pilotage, for storage, for information on patrols. Jihwan didn't lie. Every route was mapped out using his great-grandfather's chart and verified by the eye. Every forecast came true. Every client arrived alive. And every one told others. On the 25th day, 4 ships passed through Haegu. On the 30th, 8.
By the 35th, the pier was packed, and Jihwan ordered a second pier to be built. Money was flowing, not like a river, but like a stream. Yet the stream never ran dry. 300 liang a day for pilotage and storage.
By the 40th day, Jihwan's capital had surpassed 14,000 liang. He paid the second installment to the Salt Guild, 10,000. The guild official who came for the money looked at the sacks of silver and counted them 3 times. Then he asked where it came from. Jihwan replied that it was from fish. The official didn't believe him but took the money anyway. Unbo kept the records. Yorin did the counting. The 17-year-old orphan who had fed Jihwan rice on the first day turned out to be faster than any accountant at the exchange. She added and multiplied 4-digit numbers in her head without making a single mistake. Jihwan noticed this on the 3rd day when she corrected Unbo's calculation of the day's revenue. Unbo was off by 2 liang. Yorin wasn't. Jihwan put her in charge of warehouse inventory, then of all the warehouses, then of calculating routes for clients when the eye was too expensive. She didn't ask why or where. She just calculated. And when Jihwan stood on the pier at night, gazing out at the dark sea, she would bring him rice and leave in silence. On the 42nd day, what Jihwan had been waiting for and fearing finally happened. News came from Songrai. He found out from Gyeongsu. His uncle had received a report from an official of the Salt Guild, 10,000 liang ahead of schedule. His nephew's TR on the exchange board had risen to 3. 3. The boy who had been thrown out with a single servant and 12 ryong had risen to TR3 in 42 days. Gyeongsu sat in that very council chamber and stared at the board. His cousin In-ho stood behind him and was no longer laughing. His uncle placed the report on the table. He tapped his finger on the number 3. Then he summoned his man at the Salt Guild. And he gave his first order: to raise the interest rate on Haegu's debt from 15 to 25 retroactively through a forged clause in the contract. A debt of 200,000 had just become 280. Jihwan found out about this that evening. A courier brought the new statement. Unbo unrolled the scroll, and his face darkened. He showed it to Jihwan. 80,000 on top. New terms. The signature of the Salt Guild official. The seal. All according to the law. Or what his uncle called the law. Jihwan read the scroll.
Then he spent 1 liang on the eye and examined the official seal. Reading seals. A hidden clause. The interest rate could only be changed with the approval of 2 of the 7 guild heads. There was only 1 approval, so Gyeongsu's signature. There was no second signature. A forgery. Jihwan rolled up the scroll. He placed it on the table. He looked at Unbo and said 1 sentence. He'll climb even higher. And every time he climbs, I'll be waiting. Because the higher he reaches, the wider he opens his throat. Unbo nodded. He had served Jihwan's father for 20 years. He had seen the boy when he was just learning to walk. And now for the first time, he saw something other than a boy in him. Something else. That night, Jihwan burned the scroll with the falsified calculations. But he memorized the numbers. 280,000. The new price. On the 45th day, Jihwan introduced warehouse receipts. The idea was as simple as a rock and as dangerous as a knife. The merchant leaves his goods in the stone warehouse in Haegu. He receives a document bearing the port seal. The document states that 6 bales of raw silk belonging to the merchant Moon are stored in warehouse number 2. The paper is certified with Seo Jihwan's personal seal. And this paper can be sold, not the silk, but the paper. Merchant Moon receives the receipt in Haegu. He travels to Songryo. He sells the receipt to Merchant Khan. Khan arrives in Haegu and collects the silk. Or he doesn't pick it up. He sells the receipt onto someone else. The goods remain in a dry warehouse. Meanwhile, the receipt changes hands, and each resale earns Haegu 1%. 1% of the transaction amount. Peanuts, dust. But when 20 ships pass through the port each week and there are 40,000 ryang worth of goods in the warehouses, that 1% turns into 400 liang a day. No risk, no ships, no sea, just a piece of paper. The first receipt was signed by Moon Chang-ho. He already trusted the boy who had guided him safely through pirate-infested waters without a single bale being damaged. The second was signed by a merchant from Namhae, the third by the captain of a coastal vessel. By the 50th day, Haegu's warehouses held 80,000 ryang, and 32 receipts bearing Seo Jihwan's seal were in circulation. The Sonryo exchange didn't know yet, but the merchants did. They whispered among themselves at the docks and in the taverns. In Haegu, you could leave your goods and sell the paper. Paper as a commodity. No one had ever done this before. No one had thought of it. Or perhaps they had, but lacked the stone warehouses and secure routes to ensure trust. Trust. That's what Jihwan was selling. Not fish, not salt, not silk. Trust, sealed with his personal seal. Jihwan's capital by the 50th day, 28,000 liang, TR on the exchange board. 4. The very same rank from which he had fallen that night when his uncle slipped him the scroll. 4. Like a slap in the face in reverse. On the 52nd day, Jihwan stood by the warehouse and watched as Yoren handed a receipt to a merchant from Tonhae. The girl counted quickly and accurately. Not a single mistake in 3 weeks. The merchant left satisfied. Yoren approached Jihwan and handed him the daily report. 112 lian in net income from receipts. Plus 300 from brokerage fees. Plus 80 from storage. A total of 492 lian for the day. Jihwan looked at the figure and activated the eye. Not for a forecast, to assess the TR. He looked at Yoren. A number flashed above her head. TR-0. Nobody. A nameless orphan in the exchange registry. Not even a unit. 0. He looked at Unbo. TR-2. A servant with signing authority. He looked at Park Dal-Su. TR-1. The headman of a ghost village. The ticker went dark. 27,999. Every glance cost money. But this one was worth knowledge. All his people were invisible to the exchange, and therein lay the power. Because the invisible are not feared. They are not monitored. They are not blocked. Uncle kept an eye on TR-4 on the board. Uncle didn't see TR-0, who processed thousands of lian of silver every day through warehouse receipts. He didn't see TR-2, who led caravans through routes unknown to any guild. On the 55th day, 2 events occurred. In the morning, a ship arrived from Sonryo. On board was a man named Seo Gyong-soo. Not Uncle himself, his confidant, Cho Min-suk. TR-3, a cold face. Eyes like a fish's. He stepped ashore, looked around, and smirked. Then he approached Jihwan and handed him a scroll. Uncle demanded a report on the port's condition. As head of the Seo household, he had the right. Formally, Jihwan was still the manager appointed by the household, accountable. The report meant disclosure, revenues, receipts, routes, everything. Jihwan took the scroll. He spent a liang, 27,907. He read the seal, a hidden clause in the request. If Jihwan refused to submit the report, his uncle had the right, under the Seo house's internal bylaws, to dismiss the manager and appoint a new one. If he accepted it and the report showed a profit, his uncle had the right, under the same bylaws, to take 50% of the revenue as the house's share. A trap. Both options led to a dead end. Cho Min-suk stood and waited. Behind him on the ship were 6 more people. Not sailors, guards. Swords hidden under their cloaks. Jihwan rolled up the scroll and said the report would be ready in 3 days. Min-suk nodded and went back to the ship. 3 days. Jihwan stood on the pier and thought. Yoren approached. She asked what was in the scroll. He said his uncle wanted to take half. Yoren clenched her fist so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then she asked what to do. Jihwan replied, not half. Nothing. But for that to happen, he needs to stop being the manager of the Seo household. Yoren didn't understand. Jihwan explained. As long as Haegu is formally managed by the Seo household, his uncle has the right to a share, to review the accounts and approve them. Haegu needs to become independent. A port managed not by the Seo house, but by its own seal. To do this, one thing is needed:
to pay off the entire debt to the Salt Guild, 280,000. Because as long as the debt remains, the Salt Guild won't recognize the port as independent. And without the guild, Uncle can exert pressure through the Seo House's bylaws. Jihwan had 27,000. He needed 270. In 3 days. Impossible. The second event occurred that evening. Sails appeared on the horizon. Not merchant ships, warships. 7 ships flying a black flag with a silver wave. The Black Tide. A pirate clan that controlled the southern waters and took 30% of any cargo. They never called it Haegu. There was no point. There was nothing to plunder. Now there was. Rumors had spread. The port had come alive. The warehouses were full. Ships were coming and going. Someone was guiding caravans through the southern passage during those 6 hours when the patrol headed north. Someone knew the pirates' schedule. 7 ships. This wasn't a raid. It was a message. Pak Dalsu rushed to Jiwa, as white as a sail. He said that the Black Tide had dropped anchor about 2 li from the entrance to the bay. They aren't attacking. They're waiting. They're waiting for morning. In the morning, they'll come for 30% of everything in the warehouses. Or they'll burn it down. The fishermen had already hidden their families. 2 ran into the forest. Yorin stood by the warehouse and counted. 24,000 leon of goods in the warehouses. 30%. 7,200. If we hand it over, the capital will plummet to 20. And in 3 days, her uncle will take the rest, if they don't hand it over. 7 ships. 30 pirates on each. Swords, flaming arrows. The port will burn to the ground in an hour. Yorin looked at Jihwan. Unbo placed his hand on his sword. He was alone against more than 200. Jihwan stood on the pier and looked at the black sails. Then he closed his eyes. He spent 5 leon on the eye. The most expensive glance ever. TR assessment. He looked at the flagship. The captain. TR 4. But next to him was a second person. A woman. TR 3. Tall. A scar across her left temple. And her TR was flickering. Unstable. Like that of an outcast. Ryu Bichue. 26 years old. Former captain of the Black Tide. Exiled for refusing to sink a children's ship. She was here. On the flagship of the clan that had exiled her. Not as a captain. As a prisoner. Or a hostage. Or bait. Jihwan opened his eyes. He looked at Unbo. And said he was going to the pirate ship. Alone. Unbo said he wouldn't let him. Jihwan replied that he hadn't asked for permission. He took one thing with him. A warehouse receipt. Blank. With his personal seal. And a purse containing 500 leon of silver. The boat headed toward the black sails in complete darkness. The boat bumped against the side of the flagship, and Jihwan grabbed hold of the rope ladder. 4 men with short blades stood on deck. He climbed up in silence. The deck smelled of tar and blood, not fresh, but old, having seeped into the planks over the years. The captain of the Black Tide sat on a barrel by the mast, chewing on dried meat. Ko De Song, a broad face, a scar running from his ear to his chin. TR-4 on the eye, but of course he wasn't listed on the exchange. Pirates weren't registered. Next to him on the deck sat a woman with her hands bound. Ryu Bichue, a scar across her left temple, eyes like a caged she-wolf. She looked at Jihwan and didn't recognize him. How could she have known the kid who ran the show in that port-side dump? Ko De-sun tossed a bone overboard and asked why TR-1 had come aboard his ship. Jihwan corrected him. TR-4. De-sun laughed. He said that for a TR-4, the boy's arms were too skinny and his pockets too empty. Jihwan placed a purse containing 500 leon on the barrel. De-song stopped laughing. 500 leon in silver. More than the Black Tide charged a small caravan in a month. De-song reached for the purse. Jihwan didn't pull his hand away. He said it wasn't a tribute. It was a deposit. De-song asked what the deposit was for.
Jihwan replied, for insurance. He offered the pirate something no merchant on the continent had ever offered before. A share. Not 30% off every ship, that's petty and foolish. You sink a ship, you take 30. The ship won't return. The source of income is destroyed. Daesung had been doing this his whole life, and his clan lived from raid to raid. Jihwan offered something different. 15% of Haegu's insurance pool. Every merchant passing through the port pays 2% of the cargo's value into a common pool. If a ship sinks or is plundered, the pool covers the loss. The black tide gets 15% of the pool, not from the cargo, from the pool. The pool grows every day. The more ships, the more money. The fewer pirate attacks, the more ships. The more ships, the greater the 15%. Daesung stopped chewing. He was a pirate, but he wasn't a fool. Jihwan continued. There's one condition. Black tide won't touch any ships passing through Haegu. Not a single one. In exchange, Jihwan will issue identification receipts to the clan. A ship with a Haegu receipt is off limits. A ship without a receipt? Do whatever you want.
It was a brilliant offer, and Daesung understood that. The boy was offering him the chance to become a guardian rather than a robber. Not a bandit, but a partner. And he paid more for that than for plundering, because the pot kept growing, while the cargo at the bottom of the sea never did. Daesung was silent for a long time. Then he asked how the boy knew the clan's patrol schedule. Someone was guiding caravans through the southern passage at the very hours when the black tide was heading north. Someone knew the schedule. That was the reason 7 ships were anchored off Haegu, not for tribute, for an answer. Jihwan had told the truth, partially. He said he had a map, an old one, a detailed one. It showed all the currents and routes of the southern waters over the past 100 years, including the black tide's routes. Daesung stood up. His hand rested on the hilt of his blade. He said that heads were cut off for maps like that. Jihwan didn't move. He said that a head without a map was useless. The map was in his head. Kill him and you'd lose it. But alive, he would bring the clan more than the entire Southern Patrol could in a year. Daesung stood over him and thought. Then he sat down. Then he looked at Beachway.
The woman sat in silence, staring at Jihwan as if she were seeing something she didn't understand for the very first time. Daesung said he agreed, but he wanted collateral. Jihwan asked what kind. Daesung nodded toward Beachway. He said the traitor had been sentenced to death. In 3 days, she would be drowned, tied to an anchor. If the boy wanted to ransom her, it would cost 1,000 leon, a pledge of loyalty. Buy the outcast. Tie her to yourself. She'll be the guarantee that the boy won't cheat, because if he does, Daesung won't kill the boy, he'll kill her. Jihwan looked at Beachway. He activated the eye. 1 Ryang. Assessment? TR3, unstable. But there was something else below the 3. Experience. 12 years at sea. Command of a 5-ship flotilla before her exile. Knowledge of every cove from Haegu to Cape Tonne. And one detail that the eye revealed in cold, hard numbers. 16 battles. 16 victories. Not a single defeat. The display went dark. Jihwan said he'd pay, but not 1,000. 500 from the purse on the barrel, and a promissory note for the remaining 500.
A piece of paper bearing his seal that Daesung could cash in any day at the Haegu warehouse for goods worth that amount. Daesung grunted. He looked at the promissory note. He turned it over in his hands. Then he nodded. They shook hands. Not with the seal. A pirate wouldn't seal a contract with blood. A handshake. A word. And 500 silver coins, plus a piece of paper with ink. Morning of the 3rd day. Cho Min-suk stepped off the ship in a clean blue handbook, with 2 scribes following behind him. 6 guards remained on deck, their swords clearly visible. He stood in front of warehouse number 1 and demanded a report. Jihwan came out to meet him. Unbo stood behind him. Behind Unbo stood Bik-hwei. Min-suk looked at the woman with the scar, then at the boy. Then he reached out for the scroll. Jihwan handed it to him. Min-suk unrolled it and began to read. Revenues of Haegu port for 55 days. Total turnover, 3,000 leon. Expenses, 2,800. Net profit, 200 leon.
Min-sok looked up. He looked at Jihwan. 200 lian. In nearly 2 months. The boy had handed over a pitiful report with a pitiful profit.
50% of 200 is 100. 100 liang for the Seo household. His uncle would receive a document showing that his nephew was barely making ends meet and that the port was not worth his attention. Min-sok wasn't stupid. He looked around. He saw a new pier. 2 operational warehouses. Fishermen on the pier. Boats in the cove. This didn't look like 200 lian in profit. He said he wanted to inspect the warehouses. Jihwan replied that he had the right to do so. He invited him inside. Minsk entered warehouse number 1. Empty. Stone walls, a clean floor. Not a single bale. Not a single crate. Warehouse number 2. The same thing. Empty. Min-sok walked around both of them. He tapped on the walls. He peered into the corners. Nothing. He stepped outside and looked at Jihwan suspiciously. But there was nothing to find fault with. The warehouses were empty. The report shows 200 lian. The port is barely surviving. Minsk rolled up the scroll and said he would report to the head of the house. He went back to the ship. The ship weighed anchor around noon. When Minsk's sails disappeared over the horizon, Bichke turned to Jihwan and asked where the cargo was. Jihwan called out to Unbo. Unbo whistled. 4 boats emerged from around the cape on the eastern side of the bay, loaded to the brim. 24,000 lian of goods. Silk, grain, iron, oil. Everything that had been in the warehouses 3 days ago. Unbo and Yorin had transported it all in a single night to a cave beyond the cape. A stone cave that Jihwan had found on his great-grandfather's map. Dry, cool, a perfect storage place. The goods were back in the warehouses by evening. The receipts were intact. Not a single customer noticed. Bichwe watched the fishermen unload their boats and said nothing. Then she remarked that the boy was dangerous. Jihwan replied that he was careful. Those are 2 different things. Yorin stood nearby, keeping track of the returned goods. Every bale, every crate, every ketten. She didn't look up from her notes, but Jihwan noticed the corner of her mouth twitch. Almost a smile. Now Uncle would receive a report showing 200 lian in profit and calm down. For a while. Jihwan knew that Minsk didn't fully believe them. He knew his uncle would send someone else. Or come himself. But they'd bought some time. And time is money. That same evening, Jihwan gathered his people. Unbo, Bichwe, Yorin, and Park Dalsu. The 4 of them sat at a table in a warehouse by the port. He laid out the figures before them. 26,000 lian in capital. 280,000 in debt. 40 days until the deadline. The math was against them. At their current income of 500 lian a day, he could raise 20,000 in 40 days, plus the 26 they already had. That made 46. They were 234,000 short. Bichwe said it was impossible. Dalsu nodded. Yorin was silent, calculating in her head. Unbo waited. Jihwan said it was impossible if they played by the rules. He spent 10 lian on the eye, the longest session ever. The feed unfolded, and he looked at the entire continent at once. Routes, goods, prices, 7-day trends, all at the same time. His eyes filled with blood. His nose began to bleed. Yorin jumped up and pressed a cloth to his face. He didn't push her away, but he didn't stop either. 10 seconds. 20. 30. The feed went dark. 25,990. But he'd found it. Rice. The harvest in the Western Principality was a record one. The price of rice there had fallen to a 10-year low. 8 lian per sack. In Sonrio, rice cost 22. In the capital, Hwando, 30. But in 12 days, the monsoon season would begin. The western roads would be flooded. Shipments would be halted for 2 months. The price in Sonrio would jump to 45, and in Hwando to 60. If he bought rice in the west now and transported it to Sonrie in 12 days, that would mean a profit. 5-fold, at least. The problem was that he didn't have a single ship capable of reaching the Western Principality. Haegu's boats sailed along the coast, not out into the open sea. For a voyage like that, he needed a ship, a real one, with a deck and a hold. Jihwan looked at Beachway. She understood before he even spoke. She replied that she knew where to get a ship. In Qingye Bay, 2 days' journey to the east, there was an abandoned junk. A merchant had gone bankrupt and abandoned the vessel. The hull was intact. The mast was still standing. The sails had rotted, but new ones could be sewn in 3 days if they had the fabric. Jihwan asked how much it would cost. Beachway said the hull belonged to no one. It was free. The sails and repairs would cost 200 riang. Crew. We can recruit fishermen from Haegu. She'll lead them herself. Jihwan nodded. Then he turned to Yorin. He gave her the figures. Rice. 8 riang per sack in the west. The junk's hold. 300 sacks maximum. Purchases. 2,400. Sales and repairs. 200. Crew wages. 100. Provisions for the voyage. 50. Total. 2,750. Yorin did the math in her head. Selling 300 sacks at 45 lian each in Sonrio. 13,500. Net profit. 10,750. Jihwan shook his head. Not enough. 10,000 won't cut it. We needed more. He said the rice was just a decoy. The real deal would be in Sonrio. He wouldn't be selling rice. He'd be selling rice receipts. 300 receipts per sack, each with a guaranteed delivery date. Merchants in Sonrio will buy the receipts in advance because they know the monsoon is coming and prices will rise. They won't pay 45 per sack. They'll pay 60, because Haegu's receipt guarantees on-time delivery. And on-time delivery during the monsoon season is worth more than the rice itself. Yorin did the math. 300 receipts at 60. 18,000. Net profit. 15,250. Jihwan said that's one trip. The junk will make a round trip in 12 days. It'll return. It'll be loaded again. Second trip. Another 15,000. Until the end of the monsoon. 4 trips. 60,000 net. Plus current income from the port. 20,000 in 40 days. Plus existing capital. 26,000. Total by the deadline. 106,000. It's still not enough. 174,000. Beachway said he was counting like a madman. Jihwan replied that a madman counts only money. But he counts people. He turned to Dalsu. He asked how many merchants had passed through Haegu over the last month. Dalsu answered. 32. Jihwan said that each of them had paid for pilotage and storage. Each of them trusts Haegu's receipt. Each of them knows that Seo Jihwan's word is sealed with the seal. He will offer them a place in an insurance pool. Not 2% of the cargo, 10% of the capital. In return, full protection of all routes through the southern waters. Full protection, including a guarantee against pirates. Because the Black Tide is now a partner. 12 merchants out of 32 will say yes. The average capital of a small merchant, 5,000 lian. 10% of 5,000, 500. 12 merchants, 6,000. But that's just the entry fee into the pool, a one-time payment. After that, the pool runs on its own. Insurance payouts, interest, growth. By the deadline, the pool will grow to 100,000. Jihwan's share as the founder, 40%. 40,000. Yorin was counting, and her eyes widened with every number. 106 plus 40. 146. 134 short. Jihwan smiled. For the first time in 55 days. The smile was brief and cold. He said he'd get the rest from his uncle. All 4 looked at him. He explained. That scroll with the falsified interest rate on the debt. 80,000 lian added to the debt through a forged signature. The approval of just 1 guild head instead of 2. A violation. If this were presented to the Salt Guild, not the entire debt would be cancelled, but 80,000 would be forfeited, and his uncle would pay a fine equal to the amount of the forgery. Another 80. 160,000 deducted from the debt. 280 minus 160. 120. 146,000 in capital against 120,000 in debt. That's enough.
with a surplus of 26,000. Bichway looked at him and said nothing. Then she said one word. When? Jihwan replied, tomorrow. The junk. The day after tomorrow. Rice. In a week. Receipts. In 2 weeks. The pool. In 3 weeks. The salt guild. And my uncle will pay for his own greed. Bichway brought the junk to Haegu on the 4th day. The hull turned out to be sturdier than she'd said. Teak, double planking. Someone had built this ship not for coastal trade, but for the open sea. Bichway said that a bankrupt merchant had stolen it from the Iron Guild 10 years ago and abandoned it when he saw the noose coming. Jihwan spent a ryong and examined the hull with the eye. The echo of a deal. The wood was felled in the forests of the northern principality. The rivets were forged in Sonryo. The ship had passed through 7 owners. The last one wasn't a merchant, a smuggler. He transported opium through pirate waters and vanished without a trace. The eye revealed one more thing. In the hold, under the 3rd plank from the stern, there was a niche. Empty. But the echo detected a residual trace. There lay opium worth 12,000 lian. A year ago. Someone had taken it but hadn't sealed up the niche. Jihwan remembered. The niche might come in handy for something else. The sails were sewn in 2 days from canvas that Bichway had bargained for from the Tonhe fishermen in exchange for Haegu's IOU. The first IOU to leave beyond the port's boundaries as a means of payment. Bichway watched as the fisherman accepted the paper in place of silver and shook her head. She said the boy was trading air. Jihwan replied that air was the only thing on the continent more abundant than silver, and that whoever learns to sell air will buy the whole world. They assembled a crew of 10 fishermen from Haegu. Bichway checked each one. She weeded out 3. She said one was too old. The second one drank. The third couldn't swim. Jihwan asked what swimming had to do with sailing a ship. Bichway replied that if the ship sank, those who couldn't swim would be the first to panic and drag the others down. Jihwan didn't argue. She had the sea. He knew the numbers. On the 60th day, the junk set sail from Haegu. Bichway was at the helm. 7 fishermen were on deck. They were heading west. The route followed his great-grandfather's map, taking the western loop current, which cut 2 days off the journey. Jihwan stood on the pier and watched as the sail disappeared over the horizon. Yorin stood nearby with a notepad. She asked if he trusted the pirate. Jihwan replied that he trusted the numbers. Bichway receives a share of the voyage's profits, 10%. If she cheats, she'll lose more than she steals. Yorin nodded, but her eyes told a different story. She wasn't asking about trust. While the junk sailed west, Jihwan worked in the port, an insurance pool. He sent messengers to the merchants who had passed through Haegu over the past month. 12 invitations, 1 for each. A personal letter bearing his seal. An offer. An initial contribution of 10% of capital. A guarantee to cover losses from pirates, storms, and confiscations. A guarantee of safe passage through the southern waters. A guarantee signed with Seo Jihwan's seal. 9 out of 12 replied within 5 days. 7 said yes. 2 asked for time to consider. 3 did not reply. 7 merchants. Average contribution, 480 lian. 3,360, less than he had expected. But the pool was up and running. Yorin recorded every name, every amount, every condition. She worked 16 hours a day. She ate at her desk without looking up from her notes. She slept 4 hours on the warehouse floor. Jihwan told her to get more sleep. She replied that she'd catch up on sleep once the debt was paid off. On the 65th day, news arrived from Songri. Bad news. So Gyeongsu received a report from Min Sok. He read it. 200 ryong had arrived. He smirked. Then he summoned Min Sok and asked what he had seen. Min Sok said the warehouses were empty. The new wharf was up and running. People were working. That didn't add up with 200 ryong. Gyeongsu tapped his finger on the table. Then he summoned a second man. Not an official, not a merchant. A man with no name in the exchange's registry. TR0, a shadow. A spy who had worked for the Seo family for 20 years. Gyeongsu sent him to Haegu. Not on an official visit,
secretly, to keep watch, to count the ships, to check the warehouses at night, to find the real numbers. Jihwan didn't know about this. Not yet. On the 68th day, Beachway returned. The junk entered the bay, sitting 2 fingers deep in the water. The hold was full. 320 sacks of rice, 7 ryong per sack. She'd bargained for a ryong less. A bulk purchase. 2,240. Jihwan stood on the pier and counted. 320 sacks. Receipts for 60 ryong each. But it was impossible to sell directly in Songryo. His uncle kept an eye on the exchange. The arrival of a large shipment of rice under Seo Jihwan's name would attract attention. A middleman was needed. Jihwan spent 2 ryong, an eye for the market, a forecast. Rice in Sonryo, 24 ryong per sack. The monsoon in 6 days. Roads to the west closed. Price? 41 ryong. In 12 days, 53. Peak. In 20 days, 62. He was right. The numbers matched. The ticker went dark. He called for Yorin. He gave her the receipts. 320 of them, each one for 1 sack of rice at the Haegu warehouse. He told her she would go to Sonryo alone. She would sell the receipts not on the exchange, on the black market, through small-time middlemen whom the exchange doesn't track. 40 ryong each, below market price. The middlemen will snap them up because in a week they'll resell them for 60. Yorin turned pale. She said she'd never been to Sonryo, that she was 17, that she was an orphan from a fishing village, that no middleman would deal with TR0. Jihwan pulled a scroll from his bosom, a personal power of attorney in Yorin's name, with his seal, TR4. It wasn't the paper that gave her clout, it was the seal. His seal on her name meant that behind her stood a man willing to pay with his life for the authenticity of every receipt. Yorin took the scroll. Her hands were shaking. She looked at Jihwan and asked why her, not Unbo, not Bichway. He replied, Unbo is needed at the port. Bichway doesn't know the market. She does. She calculates faster than the exchange officials and hasn't made a single mistake in 2 months. And most importantly, the middlemen will see an orphan girl and let their guard down. They won't check. They won't haggle hard. That's an advantage. Yorin clenched the scroll. She stopped trembling. She nodded. She went to pack her things. Bikwei approached Jihwan afterward. She said he was sending the child to the predator's market. Jihwan replied that this child had survived in Haegu for 17 years without parents, without money, and without a name. She wasn't afraid of the predators of Songryo. Beachway snorted. Then she said something else. She said that 7 ships had passed through Haegu in the last 3 days, and not a single one had paid the black tide. Daesong gets 15% of the pot. That's less than 30% of the cargo's value, for now. Unless the flow of ships increases, Daesong will start doing the math and realize he's been cheated. Jihwan nodded. He knew. The flow was supposed to increase. And it would. Because in 12 days, the monsoon would cut off the western routes, and the only way from the west to Sonryo would be by sea, through the southern waters. Through Haegu. The flow will triple. Daesong will get his 15% from a pool 3 times larger, and he'll keep quiet. Bikwei looked at him for a long time. Then she said quietly that when he does the math, his eyes become alien, as if there's someone else behind them. Jihwan didn't answer, because sometimes he thought the same thing. Yorin returned 11 days later, thin, with dark circles under her eyes, and with a leather pouch containing 12,800 ryang of silver. 320 receipts had been sold for 40 ryang apiece. Every single one. She didn't say how. She didn't say that for the first 3 days, not a single dealer wanted to talk to a girl with no name. She didn't say that on the 4th day, she found an old money changer in the back alleys of the fish market who agreed to take 1 receipt on a trial basis. 1 bag, 40 lian. He resold it 2 days later for 52. He came back for the rest and brought 4 others with him. They went through 100 receipts that evening. The rest were sold the next day. Yorin didn't say that the money changer's name was Bae So-gil, or that he asked where the goods came from.
She replied that they were from Haegu. He laughed and said that Haegu was a backwater at the end of the world. She placed the receipt bearing Seo Jihwan's seal in front of him and said that even a backwater at the end of the world pays on time. The money changer stopped laughing. He checked the seal. It was genuine. TR4. He said he'd heard the name. The kid who trades salt made from rotten fish. Yoren confirmed it. Menelu bought all the receipts and gave her an address for the next shipment. She didn't tell Jihwan any of this. She put the bag on the table and went to sleep. She slept for a full day. 12,800. Jihwan counted it. He added it to what he already had. His capital had surpassed 40,000. The TR on the stock exchange board. A steady 4. 3 days later, the monsoon began. The western roads were submerged in mud overnight. The caravans came to a standstill. The price of rice in Sonrio jumped from 24 to 38 in 3 days, and it kept rising. The Beachway set out on its second voyage the next morning. 300 sacks, 7 lian per sack. It would return in 12 days. Yoren slept in and sat down to do the calculations. Jihwan stood on the pier and counted how many ships had entered the bay that day. 11. Twice as many as a week ago. The monsoon was driving merchants south. The only safe route lay through Haegu, through his pier, through his warehouses, through his receipts. The insurance pool had grown from 7 to 16 members in a week. Premiums, 8,000 lian. Kode Son received his 15%, 1,200. More than he'd made from 3 raids. He left the ships with Haegu's receipts alone. The rest, those sailing without receipts, paid 30% as before, or they sank. The more ships sank without receipts, the more merchants came to Haegu for receipts. Jihwan had created a system in which fear worked in his favor. Not his own fear, someone else's. On the 70th day, something happened he hadn't expected. A ship flying the Salt Guild's flag entered the bay. Not a merchant ship, an inspection vessel. A guild official came ashore and demanded a meeting with the manager. Jihwan came out. The official placed a scroll before him. The Salt Guild notified him that the debt repayment deadline had been shortened. Not 40 days. 20. 280,000 in 20 days. Or the port would pass to the guild. Jihwan read the scroll. He spent a liang. Seal reading. Authentic. 2 signatures from the guild leaders. Everything was according to the law. This wasn't his uncle's forgery. This was the guild. They had seen that the port was growing and decided to take it over sooner. Cheaper. 280,000 in 20 days instead of 40. The growing port was worth $1 million. They wanted to buy it on credit. Jihwan rolled up the scroll. He looked at the official. He asked who had initiated the shortened deadline. The official replied that it was a decision made by the 2 heads of the Soli Guild, Kwon Tae-ju, head of the eastern branch, and Min Ho-suk, head of the northern branch. Jihwan nodded. 2 names. He'd remember them. The official left. Eunbo approached and whispered that 20 days was the end. It wouldn't be enough. Not even with rice. Not even with the pool. Jihwan replied that it would be enough, because now he would unleash his master blow not in 30 days as he had planned, but in 10. A fake interest rate. 80,000 in counterfeit money. His uncle's fine was still 70, 160 minus the debt. But to do that, he had to prove the forgery to the guild. Not to an official. To 2 of the 7 leaders. The very same Kwon Tae-ju and Min Ho-suk who had just reduced the term. They were on his uncle's side. Or his uncle was on their side, or Jihwan spent 3 lian on the eye. A long gaze. He looked at the scroll with the falsified interest rate and the scroll with the reduced term. Both seals, side by side. Examining the seals confirmed what he had suspected. Kwon Tae-ju's signature on both documents was written with the same hand. But the forged interest rate document bore a different shade of ink, slightly bluer. Kwon hadn't signed the forgery himself. Someone else had signed it for him. The same handwriting, but different ink. Conclusion,
Kwon Tae-ju doesn't know about the forged document. Someone from his office signed it, on So Kyung-soo's orders. If he shows Kwon the forgery, his own signature forged, he'll fly into a rage. Not at Jihwan, but at the one who framed him, at Seo Kyung-soo. Jihwan rolled up both scrolls. He put them in his desk drawer, locked it, and began to write a letter. Not to Kwon Tae-ju, not to Min Ho-suk, to Princess Yoon So-hwa, the curator of the Imperial Treasury, the very same princess who, according to his forecast, was supposed to arrive in Haegu in a month to investigate rumors about the new stock exchange. He was accelerating the timeline. He wrote that the port of Haegu was facing pressure from the Salt Guild and that there was reason to believe the head of the Seo family had forged financial documents using the guild leader's name. This was not merely a commercial crime. It was a crime against the exchange. And the exchange was an imperial institution, formally at least, under the protection of the court. The princess could not ignore such a letter. Not because she cared about some boy from Haegu, but because forging the guild head's signature was a stab in the back to the exchange itself. And the exchange is the treasury, and the treasury is the throne. The letter was sent by courier at dawn. 20 days. A reply should arrive in 10. If the princess decides to reply. If not, then Jihwan will find another way. He always did. That evening, Yorin presented him with the daily report. 600 lian in revenue, a record. Jihwan looked at the figure and didn't smile. He was thinking about the shadow. Not the shadow under the water, the other one. The one his uncle had sent to Haegu. The spy was somewhere in the port, among the fishermen, among the dock workers, among the customers. He was counting real ships, real profits, real numbers. And when he sent the report to his uncle would find out everything. 20 days. The spy, the Salt Guild, uncle. 3 blows at once. Jihwan stood on the pier and looked out at the dark sea. The water was warm, too warm for this time of year. The fishermen said the fish were moving away from the shore, deeper than usual, as if they were afraid of something. On the 76th day, Jihwan found the spy. Not through the eye. Yorin. She was counting cargo at the pier and noticed that one of the dock workers was counting along with her. Not sacks, ships. A man in his 30s, plain-looking, quiet. He'd been hired 5 days ago. He worked well, didn't complain. But every evening he would walk to the Eastern Cape and stand there alone. Yorin followed him. The man lit a lantern. 3 short flashes. 2 long ones. A signal. To someone at sea. She told Jihwan. He spent a liang and looked at the dock worker through the eye. TR-0 in the registry. But the echo of the transaction on his clothes showed something else. Fabric from Sonryo. Tailored in a workshop in the Chiono district, the very same district where the Seo family's house stood. Buttons made of northern forged copper. The kind worn by servants of the highest-ranking trading houses. Not a porter. Her uncle's spy. Jihwan didn't touch him. He didn't kick him out. He didn't even let on that he knew. He did something else. He called for Yorin and gave her a new assignment. From that day on, she kept 2 sets of accounts. The real one, and a second one, the one the spy would see. The real accounts showed 600 riang in daily revenue and growing capital. The second set, 300, declining, supply issues. 2 clients refused to sign receipts. Warehouse number 2 was leaking. Yorin kept the second set of records just as meticulously as the first, with the same seals, with the same dates, but with different numbers. The spy saw the second set. The real one lay hidden under the warehouse floor. The uncle would receive reports that his nephew was drowning. Slowly, inexorably, and he wouldn't step in to finish him off. Because why finish off a drowning man? Let him drown on his own. 3 days later, a reply arrived from the capital. Not from the princess, from her office. An official scroll bearing the imperial seal. Princess Yoon So-hwa, curator of the Imperial Treasury, announced that an imperial audit of Haegu Port was scheduled for the 23rd day of the current month. For verification. An audit. Not an investigation. An audit. Subtler. Gentler. But sufficient.
The princess would arrive in person. In 14 days. 6 days before the due date for repayment of the debt to the Salt Guild. If Jihwan shows her the forged signature of Quan Daeju during the audit, the princess, as a representative of the Imperial Treasury, has the right to freeze the debt until the investigation is complete. Freeze. Not cancel it. But the freeze would give him time. Time he hadn't had. Unbo read the scroll and, for the first time in 2 months, allowed himself to exhale. Jihwan didn't breathe a sigh of relief. He knew his uncle wouldn't stop. The spy sent signals every evening. His uncle received false figures and believed his nephew was drowning. But sooner or later, someone would tell him the truth. A merchant, an official, a rumor. And rumors in Sonrio traveled faster than couriers. On the 80th day, Beachway returned. The second rice shipment, 310 sacks. She sailed into the bay and saw 20 ships at the pier, 3 times as many as when she had left. Beachway went ashore and walked around the port. 3 new warehouses were under construction, their frames made of stone and wood. Workers hammered away from dawn until dusk. The fishing village around the port had grown by a third. New huts, new faces. Merchants who had stayed to wait out the monsoon instead of risking the sea. They lived in Haegu. They ate Haegu fish. They paid for storage. They paid for receipts. They paid for pilotage. Beachway approached Jihwan and said that he had built a city. He replied that he had built a mechanism. The city was a byproduct. Jihwan did not sell the rice from his second voyage using receipts. The price in Sonrio was already 53 ryong per sack. In 10 days, it would be 62. The peak. He left the rice in the warehouse and issued receipts, but did not sell it. He held on to it. When the price reached its peak, he would sell it all at once through Pei Sogol, the money changer Yorin had found.
The broker was already waiting. He wrote to Yorin that he was ready to take any volume. Jihwan's capital by the 80th day, 53,000 ryong, including the unsold rice worth 19,000. The insurance pool, 22 participants. Total volume, 15,000. Jihwan's share, 6,000. Current daily income, 800 leon. TR on the exchange board, 4. Stable. But the numbers inside were already at 5. The exchange updated the TR once every 10 days. The next update was in 4 days. The 4 would become a 5. TR 5. Head of a trading house. The boy who had been kicked out with 12 leon would, in 80 days, rise to the level of the heads of trading houses. And then someone in Sonrio would take notice. On the 83rd day, it happened. The exchange's scoreboard was updated at noon. From Jihwan. TR 5. The clerk at the Sonrio exchange who was entering the record froze. He reread it. Then he called the senior clerk. The senior clerk reread it. He called for the registrar. The registrar read it over and went to the elder. Han Ui Chol, head of the Seven Seals Exchange. TR 7. 72 years old. An old man who had witnessed the rise and fall of trading houses over half a century. He was sitting in his office on the top floor of the temple, drinking tea, when the registrar placed the updated registry before him. Hanui Chul looked at the name. Seo Jihwan. He looked at the number. 5. He looked at the date of the last update. 83 days ago. 1. He set down his cup. He reached for the bell on the table. He rang it. His secretary entered. Han Ui Chul said 2 words. Cancel the meeting. The secretary asked, which one? Han replied, all of them. He stood up from behind his desk. For the first time in 30 years, he asked for a horse. For the first time in 30 years, he left Sonrio. He rode south to Haegu to see it with his own eyes. Meanwhile, in the boardroom of the Seo family's house, Seo Gyong-soo stood looking at the same display. TR-5. Nephew. 5. In 3 months, the boy had covered a distance that had taken Gyong-soo himself 15 years. The spy had been sending false figures. 300 ryang a day, losses, leaks, all lies. The 5 on the display couldn't have come from just 300 ryang. Gyong-soo realized he was being deceived. His fist slammed down on the table so hard that the inkwell jumped. His cousin In-ho stood behind him silent. Kyung-soo turned to him and ordered him to prepare a ship, but not to Haegu, to the Salt Guild headquarters, to Kwon Taeju. If he couldn't take the port by force, there was another way. He knew which contract he had forged. He knew the second signature was fake. Now he had to get rid of the evidence, quickly, before his nephew figured out how to use it. But his nephew had already used it. The scrolls lay in a hiding place under the warehouse floor. Copies were on their way to the princess via courier. And that same evening, Jihwan retrieved the original forged interest contract from the hiding place. He looked at it by candlelight and said quietly, "Uncle, you just went one step further. Thank you." 20 days until the deadline. 14 until the princess arrives. 10 until the peak of the rice price. And somewhere on the road between Songre and Haegu, an old man who had run the stock exchange for 50 years was traveling. He was going to see the boy who, in 83 days, had gone from 0 to a 5. That evening, the fisherman said again that the water was warm, warmer than yesterday, and that the fish had gone even deeper. Han Yui-chol arrived in Haegu on the 86th day, without an entourage, without banners. An old man in a gray traveling hanbok on a weary horse. No one at the port recognized him. He tied his horse up at the tavern and walked along the pier, in silence. Counted the ships, 24. Counted the warehouses, 5. 2 old stone ones, 3 new ones, under construction. He counted the people, dock workers, fishermen, merchants, clerks with clipboards. A girl of about 17 stood by a warehouse and handed out papers to the merchants. Every merchant bowed to her. To her. TR0. Because in her hands was a paper bearing the TR5. Kan Yichol stood on the pier for 3 hours. Then he sat down in a tavern and ordered tea. The tavern owner struck up a conversation. He explained that the manager was a young man from the north. He'd arrived with a single servant. There was nothing. 0 ships. And now look, 24 in the bay. And the pirates aren't touching them. It's some kind of miracle. Or maybe not a miracle. The young manager calculates faster than the stock exchange. The innkeeper lowered his voice and added that yesterday, goods worth 6,000 leon passed through the warehouse, in a single day. Kan Yikol finished his tea. He stood up and walked to the port shed that served as the manager's office. The door was open. Jihwan was sitting at the table reading scrolls. Unbo was standing by the door. The old man entered. Unbo took a step toward him, but Jihwan raised his hand. He recognized him not by his face. No one under 50 knew the face of the exchange's elder. Han Yikol never appeared in public, but Jihwan had spent a liang and seen it. TR7, the only TR7 not belonging to the guild. The elder. His eye revealed something else. Behind the 7, a number flickered that Jihwan was seeing for the first time. Not a number, a symbol. A seal within a seal, like a watermark. Jihwan stood up. He bowed. His first bow in 3 months, not because he had to, because the old man deserved it. Han Yui-chol sat down on a bench and looked at the boy for a long time. Then he said he'd come to take stock. Jihwan replied that he could check the ledger. Han replied that the ledger showed numbers. He'd come to look at the person behind the numbers. They talked for 2 hours. Han asked questions. Jihwan answered. Where did the warehouse receipts come from? Out of necessity. Who came up with the insurance pool? Logic. How did he forge an alliance with the Black Tide? Arithmetic. It's more profitable for pirates to get 15% of a growing pool than 30% of a dwindling caravan. Khan nodded. He didn't smile. But he didn't frown either. He asked one last question. Why Haegu? Of all the ports on the coast, why this one? Jihwan replied that he'd been exiled here. He hadn't chosen it. Khan shook his head. He said that wasn't the point. He said that 200 years ago, the port of Haegu had been the capital of southern trade. Then one day, it all collapsed. The ships left. The people fled. No one knows why. The exchange sealed the archives from that year. Han looked Jihwan in the eyes and asked if he knew what lay at the bottom of the sea off Haegu. Jihwan didn't answer, because he didn't know.
But the eye inside his skull twitched, on its own, without a command, without a trace of silver. A single beat, like a heartbeat. Khan saw the boy's pupils flicker. For a split second, gold. The old man stood up, silently. He bowed to Jihwan. The port manager didn't deserve a bow from TR7. But Han Hui-chol wasn't bowing to the manager. He was bowing to something he'd seen behind the golden flash in the stranger's eyes. He left that very evening. Without explanation. He left no gifts. He made no promises. On the road to Sonryo, he rode in silence. And at the pass, when Haegu disappeared behind the hills, he uttered a single phrase into the void. "Prepare the 8th seat." The horse snorted. The wind carried the word south. On the 88th day, Jihwan sold the rice. All 310 sacks with receipts. Pei Sogul in Sonryo paid 58 ryang per sack. Not 62 as at the peak. Jihwan sold early because he needed the money now, not in 10 days. 17,980 ryang. The courier delivered the silver 5 days later. Capital, 71,000. Plus a share of the pool, 10,000. Plus earnings for the remaining days until maturity, about 6,000. Total as of the payment date, 87,000. Against 280,000 in debt. Excluding the forgery. Including the forgery. 120,000 in debt. 87,000 in capital. 33,000 short. The Bichve had set out on its 3rd voyage, but it wouldn't return before the due date. Rice will arrive late. 33,000 in 10 days. 6,000 from port revenue. 27,000 short. Jihwan stood on the pier at night, weighing his options. Sell part of the warehouse receipts below market value. No. It would undermine confidence in the system. Borrow from Deson. No. A pirate wouldn't lend money. He's a partner, not a banker. Sell a share in the pool. No. He'd lose control. Then, what? His eye twitched. Without a command. Again. For the 2nd time in 3 days. And Jihwan saw it. Not the cargo, not the route, not the price. He saw a ship. One. Far to the south. Huge. A merchant junk of a class he'd never seen before. 6 masts. A hold for 1,000 bales. It was coming from the south, from beyond the horizon. No flag, no identifying marks. And it was headed for Hague. The ship entered the bay at dawn on the 90th day. 6 masts. A black hull. Not a single flag. The fishermen on the pier froze. Ships like that didn't sail in southern waters. Ships like that hadn't sailed anywhere at all for 200 years. Pak Dalsu turned pale. He said his grandfather had told him about ghost ships with black hulls that appeared off the coast of Haegu once a generation. Every time, before disaster struck. Jihwan stepped out onto the pier. He spent 2 lian on the eye. Assessment. Ship. Echo of a deal. Wood. Black teak. Age. 215 years. Rivets. An alloy Jihwan didn't recognize. Not a single trace of the owner. Emptiness. As if the ship belonged to the sea. The captain descended the gangplank. A woman. 60 years old. Gray hair tied back in a bun. A face like dried leather. Dark, unmoving eyes. She bore no sign of belonging to the guild or any house. Jihwan looked at her with the eye. 1 liang. TR. No number appeared. Instead, the same symbol. A seal within a seal. The one that Jihwan had seen behind Elder Han's TR7. But here the symbol was brighter, sharper, as if it were burning. The woman stopped in front of Jihwan. She looked up at him because she was a head shorter, and she said one word. Air. Jihwan didn't move. He asked who she was. The woman replied that her name was Ma Jung-sun, that she was the guardian of the Southern Path, that the ship was called the Last Keel, and that it belonged to the one who bore the seal within the seal. Jihwan said he didn't understand. Ma Jung-sun smiled. She asked if he could see the symbol when he looked at her. Jihwan nodded. She said that this symbol was the seal of Li Zhongha,
the Sea Dragon, TR9, the founder of the exchange, who had disappeared 200 years ago. Jihwan knew that name. Every merchant on the continent knew it. A legend, a myth. The man who created the Seven Seals Exchange and vanished. Ma Jongsun said that Li Zhongha hadn't disappeared. He left because he had to. He sealed something at the bottom of the sea near Haegu and left 8 guardians to keep the seal in place. 7 became guilds. The 8th became the guardian of the Southern Path, her ancestor. The ship, the last keel, sailed along the southern coast for 200 years, waiting for Li Zhongha's seal to awaken in the blood of the air. It awoke 3 months ago. The very second her uncle tore the name from Jihwan, the clan's seal flared up. Ma Jongsun sensed it from 1,000. Jihwan was silent for a long time. Then he asked what lay at the bottom. Ma Jongsun replied that she didn't know. That she knew only one thing. The higher the air's TR, the more the seal cracks. And that when the TR reaches 9, the seal will open. What will come out? No one among the living knows. Jihwan processed this. Then he said that he had no time for legends. He had 10 days until the debt was due, and he was short 27,000 ryong. Ma Jongsun nodded. Then she turned toward the ship and shouted, "Open the hold!" The hold opened. Jihwan looked down. Goods. Not just any goods. Spices from the southern islands. Cinnamon, cloves, black pepper, nutmeg. Crates lined the ship from side to side. Jihwan had spent 2 lian. Forecast. Spices. Cinnamon. Price in Songrio. 240 lian per crate. Trend. Stable. Cloves. 310. Pepper. 180. Nutmeg. 420. He was counting. His eyes darted back and forth. Yoren came over and counted along with him. Out loud. Cinnamon. 40 crates. 9,600. Cloves. 20. 6,200. Pepper. 60. 10,800. Nutmeg. 10. 4,200. Total. 30,800. Jihwan looked at Ma Jongsun. He asked what she wanted for the cargo. She replied, "Nothing. The ship belongs to the heir. So does the cargo. Li Zhongha's seal transferred ownership to her. She is the custodian, not the owner." Jihwan looked at her and didn't believe her. 30,000 silver, for free. He activated seal reading. 2 lian. He looked at Ma Jongsun. No hidden contracts, no traps. Clean. The woman was telling the truth. Or perhaps the eye hadn't detected any deception. Jihwan accepted the cargo. Not because he believed her, because he had no choice. He was 27,000 short. 30,000 lay in the hold. Arithmetic is stronger than faith. Yurin drew up the receipts. The spices went into the warehouse. Ma Jongsun stayed at the port. She said she wouldn't leave again. That the last keel would anchor in Haegu Bay and remain there until the seal decided otherwise. Big Hui returned from her 3rd voyage that same day. She saw the 6-masted ship in the bay and nearly fell off the gangplank. She recognized that silhouette. Every pirate of the southern seas knew it. The Black Keel. A ghost ship. A legend told in taverns to scare newcomers. Bichui approached Jihwan and asked who he was. Not what. Who? She was no longer asking about the port manager. Not about the boy with 12 scars. She was asking about the golden flash in his eyes that she'd seen that night at the pier. Jihwan replied that he didn't know. And for the first time, it was the truth. Capital by the 90th day. 118,000, including spices and the 3rd rice voyage. Debt, the forgery. 120,000. It was enough. For the first time. With a margin to spare. But the forgery still had to be proven. And there were 4 days left until the princess arrived. Meanwhile, Seo Jihwan was on his way to Quan Taeju to destroy the evidence. A race. Who would get there first? His uncle to the guild leader? Or the princess to Haegu? Jihwan couldn't speed up the princess, but he could slow down his uncle. He wrote a letter, a short one, addressed to Seo Jihwan personally. He sent it by courier to intercept him. The letter contained 3 lines. Uncle, I know about Kwon Tae-ju's signature. I have the original. Come yourself, or I'll come to you. Uncle will read this and stop. He won't go to Kwon. He'll go to Haegu. Because the original of the forgery is a noose around his neck, and he'll want to retrieve it personally. Jihwan was setting a trap. Uncle is the bait. The princess is the snare. If both arrive in Haegu on the same day, Uncle won't be able to destroy the evidence in front of an imperial witness. Princess Yoon So-hwa arrived on the 94th day. Not incognito. An imperial ship. A golden flag. 12 guards. She stepped onto the pier in a white hanbok with silver embroidery and looked out at the harbor. 28 ships in the bay. 6 warehouses. Hundreds of people. And a black 6-masted giant at the far pier. She had seen Haegu on maps. A dot on the edge of nowhere. Ruins. Debt. 3,000 starving people. What stood before her was not ruins. It was a port. A real one. Alive. Functioning. In just 3 months. Jihwan came out to meet her. He bowed as protocol required. She looked at him. 19 years old. A gaunt face. Dark circles under his eyes. The hands of a merchant, not a nobleman. She asked if he was Seo Jihwan. He confirmed it. She demanded a report. A complete one. For the imperial audit. Jihwan led her through the port. 4 hours. Every warehouse. Every receipt. Every figure. Yoren walked beside her, handing her slates with the records. The princess looked at the figures and said nothing. Her clerk took notes. His face grew paler with every warehouse. By the end of the tour, the princess stopped at the pier. She looked at Jihwan and asked, "How?" One word. How? Jihwan replied that he had counted. She said that everyone counts. Everyone's results are different. He replied that his count is more accurate. She didn't smile. But she stopped looking at him as if he were a little boy. Then he showed her the scrolls, both of them. The original, a forgery with a fake signature by Kwon Tae-ju, and the scroll shortening the repayment term, signed by the real Kwon. Side by side. One was in blue ink. The other was darker. One signature was slightly smaller. The other was larger. The princess was the curator of the imperial treasury. She had seen forgeries. She had seen this one. The clerk took note. The princess raised her head and said that this was enough to freeze the debt pending an investigation, but not enough for annulment. To annul it, Kwon Tae-ju himself must confirm that he did not sign it. Jihwan said that Kwon would confirm it, because the alternative is a charge of complicity. It's his signature, whether it's forged or not. If he says he signed it himself, he's an accomplice to fraud. If he says he didn't sign it, he's a victim of forgery. And he'll point the finger at the one who forged it, at Seo Jihwan. The princess nodded. The logic was sound. Kwon would choose to be the victim, always. At that moment, another ship entered the bay, flying the Seo family's flag. Seo Jihwan had arrived in person, just as Jihwan had calculated. His uncle stepped ashore, and the first thing he saw was the imperial flag, golden, flying from the mast of the princess's ship. He froze on the gangplank. Then he saw his nephew, standing next to the princess, next to the scrolls on the table, next to the clerk who was writing down every word. Jihwan understood, instantly. His face turned ashen. He turned toward the gangplank, back to the ship, to flee. Unbo was standing by the gangplank. His hands were as thick as an anchor chain. He didn't touch his uncle. He just stood there. Jihwan stopped. He looked at Unbo, then at his nephew, then at the princess, then at the scrolls. He slowly walked down to the pier. He approached. He stood before the table. The princess introduced herself, officially. Curator of the Imperial Treasury, authorized to conduct audits. Jihwan bowed. deeply, deeper than protocol required. The princess placed a scroll with a falsified interest rate in front of him and asked if he recognized the document. Kyung-soo replied that he did not. The princess asked if he recognized the signature of Kwon Tae-oj's signature on it. Kyung-soo replied that he could not say for certain. The princess said that the signature was forged and that an investigation would determine who had done it, and that until the investigation was complete, Haegu Port's debt to the Salt Guild was frozen. Completely. Kyung-soo stood there in silence. His face was ashen. His hands were behind his back.
Jihwan looked at his uncle,
The very man who had poured him tea with honey and slipped him the scroll knife, who had smiled when the scoreboard showed a 1, who had sent him to die in a hole at the edge of the world. Jihwan wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply looking. And his uncle saw in that gaze what he feared more than an imperial investigation. Calm. The absolute, cold, calculating calm of a man who wasn't finished yet. The princess announced that she would remain in Haegu until the audit was complete. Kyung-soo left that same evening. By ship. Silently. Without a word. Cousin In-ho stood on the deck and did not look toward the shore. Yurin approached Jihwan afterward. She said the debt had been frozen, that they could breathe a sigh of relief. Jihwan shook his head. A freeze isn't a cancellation. The investigation would take months. During those months, his uncle would destroy the evidence, bribe the witnesses, find another way. No, Jihwan wasn't going to wait for the investigation. He was going to settle the debt. Completely. 200,000. No fake 80,000s. Out of his own pocket. And then take everything from his uncle.
Not through the courts.
Through the stock exchange. Capital on the 94th day. 122,000. A debt without any fakes. 200,000. He was 78 short. 2 months ago, that had been an insurmountable gap. Now he had a port through which a quarter of the southern coast's trade passed, an insurance pool of 26 merchants, a fleet consisting of 1 junk and 1 ghost ship, and a map of the entire continent in his head. 78,000. He'll find it. Chapter Summary. Princess Yoon Seo-hwa conducted an audit of Haegu and discovered a forged signature by Kwon Tae-ju. She froze the debt pending an investigation. So Kyung-soo arrived at the trap and saw that his nephew was working with the imperial court. He left without a word. Jihwan decided not to wait for the investigation, but to pay off the entire debt of 200,000 on his own. He was short 78,000. For the next 60 days, Jihwan slept no more than 4 hours. He worked. The machine he'd built in Haegu over 3 months now ran on its own, but every gear had to be lubricated and checked. Every day. Every hour. Bitch Hay left on the 4th rice shipment 3 days after the debt was frozen. The monsoon was still going strong. The western roads were stuck in mud up to the axles. The price of rice in Songri had risen to 58 riang per sack. She returned 11 days later with 340 sacks. Purchased at 7 riang each. Sold on credit at 54. Yorin shipped the batch through Bay Sogol and received 18,360. Net profit after expenses, 15,000. The 5th trip brought in the same amount. The 6th was slightly less because the monsoon was weakening and the western roads were beginning to dry out. The price in Sanrio had dropped to 43. But 13,000 net is still 13,000. Ma Cheong-song's spices were sold on IOUs in the very first week. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper, 30,000 in silver. But Jihwan didn't sell the nutmeg. 10 crates stood in the far corner of warehouse number 3, locked away separately. Yorin asked why. Jihwan answered with a single word, wedding. She didn't understand. 40 days later, the wedding of the 3rd prince was celebrated in the capital, Hwando.
nutmeg was needed for the ceremonial incense.
The imperial court purchased it through the Grain Guild at a fixed price. But this year, the Grain Guild had lost a supplier. The southern island with the muscat groves had been submerged after a storm. Muscat had become a rarity. He could tell the price would double. Jihwan waited. 40 days. Then he sold it. 830 liang per crate. 8,300. from 10 crates that had cost 4,200. A twofold profit. Yorin jotted down the figure and shook her head. Then she asked how he'd found out about the wedding. Jihwan replied that the prince's wedding had been announced half a year ago. Public information. Anyone could have read about it. But no one had connected the wedding to Muscat because no one had thought that far ahead. But he had. Always. The insurance pool grew every week. After the debt freeze and the news that Princess Yoon So-hwa was personally behind the audit of Haegu, merchants flocked to the pool like moths to a flame. Imperial patronage, protection from pirates, guaranteed receipts. The three pillars upon which the pool stood. By the 120th day, there were 28 participants. By the 130th, 35. By the 150th, 42. The pool's total capital, 38,000. Jihwan's share as the founder, 40%, 15,200. Every month, his share grew because the pool was growing. Money made money. Beachway was building a fleet, not buying one. It built them. On the eastern shore of the bay, Jihwan established a shipyard. The idea came to him on the 100th day as he stood on the pier watching a trading junk from Namhae enter the bay. Slow, heavy, old. Its sides were rotten, the mast creaked. Such ships cost 5,000 leon and sailed for 10 years before falling apart. Jihwan spent 2 leon on the eye. He looked at the blueprints in his great-grandfather's diary, which he had committed to memory. There were plans for light junks, a narrow hull, double keel, gaff sails. A 200-year-old design that no one had built because the blueprints were thought to be lost. According to his great-grandfather's calculations, such a junk cost 1,800 leon, almost 3 times cheaper than the guild's ships.
And it was 30% faster thanks to the hull's contours and its rigging.
Bichwei found the craftsmen, 6 shipbuilders from Tonhae, old men who remembered how to build the old-fashioned way, rather than according to the guild's standards. She enticed them with a share of the profits from every ship built, 2% of the sale price for life. The master builders arrived and examined the blueprints. The eldest among them, Master Kwok, sat down on a bench and remained silent for a long time. Then he said he had seen such blueprints only once, in his grandfather's book. The Iron Guild had burned that book 100 years ago when it established its monopoly on shipbuilding. He thought the blueprints were lost forever. How did a young boy come by them? Jihwan didn't answer. Master Kwok didn't ask a second time. He began building. The first junk was launched on the 120th day. Bichwei stood on the deck. The wind ruffled the hair near the scar on her temple. She steered the vessel through the bay and felt the hull cutting through the water. Smoothly, smoothly, without a jolt. The light junk cut through the water like a knife through butter. The fishermen at the pier watched in silence. Then they burst into applause. The first ship built in Haegu in 200 years. Bikwei docked and went ashore. She approached Jihwan. Her eyes sparkled. She said one thing, then another. Master Kwok built 1 junk every 10 days. By the 150th day, there were 12 in the water. Bikwei assembled her crew. Fishermen from Haegu who had grown up on these waves and knew every shoal. Former pirates whom Daesong had released as surplus to requirements because guarding was more profitable than plundering. Sailors from Tonhae and Namhae, drawn by rumors of a port where wages were paid on time and no one was drowned for debts. Everyone received a salary. Everyone signed Haegu's seal of loyalty, legally more valuable than gold. Bikwei was in command. She ruled with an iron fist. Without shouting, but in such a way that not a single sailor dared to be late for deck duty. She led the crews on training voyages through the southern waters. Formation, maneuvering, signals. Within a month, the 12 junks moved as one, plus a trading junk from Qingyi Bay, plus the last keel, 14 pennants. Hagu's fleet, larger than the Seo families, larger than half the trading houses on the continent. On the 150th day, Jihwan recruited 3 captains from the Black Tide. Not by force, not with threats, with arithmetic. Each of the 3 received a monthly salary of 200 liang from Daesong, plus a share of the loot. Unpredictable. Sometimes 500. Sometimes nothing. Sometimes an arrow in the side. Jihwan offered each of them 500 lian a month, guaranteed, plus a share of the insurance pool. Guaranteed. No arrows, no chases. No risk of the Imperial fleet hanging them from the yardarm. They thought it over for 2 days. Then they came. One of them, Captain No Gison, sailed his ship straight into Haegu and asked for a receipt. A pirate. He asked for a receipt. Park Dal-su stood on the pier and watched. Then he said the world had turned upside down. Jihwan replied that the world hadn't turned upside down. The numbers had simply fallen into their proper places. Daesong had no objections. His 15% share of the pot had risen to 4,000 a month. He was well fed. His men were well fed. The 3 captains left. So be it.
War was more costly than the loss of 3 ships.
Princess Yoon Seok-hwa didn't leave. The audit concluded a week after her arrival. The documents were finalized. The forgery was confirmed. The investigation was referred to the Imperial Chancellery. She could have left. She should have left. She didn't leave. She said that, as an Imperial observer, she had to monitor the situation until the investigation was complete. That was true. Partly. She sat in the tavern every evening and watched Jihwan work. How he calculated. How his eyes would sometimes flicker with gold when he thought no one was watching. On the 110th day, she asked him to explain the warehouse receipts. Jihwan sat down across from her and explained it in 20 minutes. Mechanics, guarantees, turnover, trust as currency. She listened without interrupting. Then she was silent for a moment. Then she said that if the receipts became the exchange's standard, goods would no longer need to be physically transported from seller to buyer. Just paper. Paper is faster, cheaper, safer. An entire continent could trade in paper instead of sending caravans through pirate-infested waters. Jihwan nodded.
He said that's exactly how it would be. In a year, maybe 2.
She looked at him for a long time. With that same gaze Yorn had seen through the warehouse window when she thought no one was watching her. The princess said she would stay for another month, for the audit. Bichwi heard this conversation through the wall. She stood motionless. Then she went to the shipyard. She didn't say a word. But Master Kwok noticed that she was hammering louder than usual that day. Yoren heard it too. She squeezed her notepad until it cracked. The thin wood split. She looked at the crack. She took out a new notepad. She went back to the numbers. Romance playing in the background. All 3 of them knew. Until revenge was complete. Until the number on the scoreboard surpassed her uncle's. Until the council hall of the Seo household passed into other hands. His heart was sealed shut. By the 150th day, Jihwan's capital, 248,000 lian. The TR on the stock exchange board had been updated. 6 from Jihwan. 6 from Gyeongsang. 6. 2 6s side by side. The nephew caught up to his uncle. In 150 days,
From 12 lian and a hole at the edge of the world.
to the level of the head of the house, who had been building his 6 for 15 years. The attendant at the stock exchange temple updated the record and looked at the 2 identical numbers. Then he shrugged. It happens. It doesn't happen. Gyeongsu saw it. Every morning he went into the temple of the stock exchange and looked at the board. Every morning he saw his nephew's number creeping upward. 4, 5, 6. Now 6. Equal. He didn't sleep. He drank rice wine until dawn. His cousin In-ho came by one morning and cautiously suggested that maybe it was time to back off. To forget. To let the boy go. Gyeongsu struck him across the face. The ring sliced his eyebrow. In-ho walked out in silence, wiping away the blood. Gyeongsu sat down at the table and summoned his last ally, a man in the Silk Guild. One final blow. A secret contract. The Silk Guild refused to accept any cargo from Haegu, a complete blockade. Not a single bale of silk leaving the port of Haegu would be accepted at any warehouse or market controlled by the guild.
and the Silk Guild controlled 80% of the silk trade on the continent.
The silk accounted for a quarter of Haegu's turnover. Without silk, revenues would drop by 25%. Without revenues, the debt would not be repaid on time. The freeze wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, the court would issue a ruling, and if Haegu hadn't paid off the 200,000 by then, the port would pass to the Salt Guild, and Gyeongsu would receive a commission and a seat on the Council of Seven, just as he had planned a year ago. Gyeongsu waited, patiently. He had learned this from his nephew, a bad teacher, but the lesson was learned. Jihwan found out about the blockade 2 days later. Merchant Moon Chang-ho came in person, angry. The guild's warehouse in Songryo had refused to accept his raw silk. They said they didn't take anything from Haegu. Orders from above. Moon asked what to do. Jihwan spent 3 ryang on the eye, a long gaze, a prediction. A blockade of the Silk Guild. Duration, 3 months at a minimum. Losses for Haegu, 400 lian per day. 12,000 per month, 36 per quarter. Serious. It hurts, but it's not fatal. Because Jihwan saw what his uncle didn't. Raw silk isn't silk.
The guild controlled the finished product. Fabrics, rolls, brocade, embroidery. But the raw material, the silkworm cocoons, that's the field. Trees, worms. That's not the guild. That's the farmer. Jihwan found him 2 lian away from the eye. Cho Haesu, TR2. An old man from the Western Principality. He owned a mulberry tree plantation the size of a small principality. He supplied 80% of the cocoons to the Silk Guild. Without him, the guild couldn't produce fabric. Without fabric, there was no trade. Without trade, there was no guild. Jihwan sent Bichwei. She reached the plantation in 7 days. She met with Cho Haesu. She laid the contract before him. Exclusive supply of all cocoons to Haegu, at a price 20% higher than the guild's, plus a share in the insurance pool, plus a guaranteed buyback for the next 3 years. Sealed by Seo Jihwan, TR-6. The old farmer looked at the number. A 6. The guild had a 7. But the guild paid him at the standard rate and was late with payments every quarter. And this young man from Haegu was offering 20% more and a 3-year guarantee. Sealed with a seal. The farmer thought about it for a day. Then he signed it.
Bichwei delivered the contract 2 weeks later.
The Silk Guild was left without raw materials. The first week, silence. The second, rumors. The third, the head of the Silk Guild personally sent a messenger to Haegu. Not with a threat, with a request for a meeting. Jihwan met with him at the Port Tavern. The head of the guild was a heavy-set man with heavy eyelids. TR-7. He sat down at the table and rested his hands on his knees. He said the guild was ready to lift the blockade. In exchange, Haegu would return the contract with Cho Haesu. Jihwan replied that Haegu would keep the contract, but the Silk Guild could buy cocoons from Haegu at market price, through receipts. The guild master looked at the boy. The boy didn't blink. The guild master nodded. The blockade was lifted 10 days later, quietly, without any announcements. His uncle lost his last ally. Jihwan paid off his debt to the Salt Guild on the 160th day. 200,000 lian in silver, in full. Not counting the 80 counterfeit lian that burned during the freezing. He could have waited for the investigation. Could have waited for the debt to be annulled. Could have saved money. But he didn't.
Because a free port is stronger than a debt-bound one. And because he wanted his uncle to see the number. 200,000. Closed. Ahead of schedule. Out of the pocket of a boy who'd been kicked out a year ago with 12 lian. An official from the Salt Guild arrived for the money with a 10-man security detail. 200,000 in silver is 6 chests. Heavy ones. He counted them 4 times. He kept losing count. Yorin sat across from him and waited. Every time he lost count, she called out the correct number. The official looked at her and said nothing. Then he signed the document. He affixed the guild's seal to the document confirming the debt had been fully settled.
Haegu Port was free. Not a single debt. Not a single obligation. Not a single string anyone could pull. An independent port under the management of Seo Jihwan. When the official left, Park Dal-soo came to Jihwan. He stood before him, and for the first time ever, he bowed. Deeply. All the way to the floor. Then he stood up and said that the fisherman wanted to place a stone at the pier, bearing the manager's name and the date the debt was settled. Jihwan replied that it was too soon for the stone.
Dal-soo asked why. Jihwan did not answer. The TR on the stock exchange board was updated 3 days later. With Jihwan, 7. With Gyeonsu, 6. For the first time in a year, his nephew was higher. At the exchange temple in Songryo, the minister updated the record. He looked at the number. 7. A 20-year-old boy. 7. The level of the great guilds. He called for the senior member. The senior member called for the keeper. The keeper did not go to the elder. The elder already knew. Kan Yui-chol sat in his office on the top floor of the temple, holding a scroll in his hand. The minutes of the Council of 7. The agenda. The first and only item, approval of the 8th seat. The vote was scheduled for the 360th day, 200 days from now. Kan placed the scroll on the table. He looked out the window. To the south. He knew something no one else on the council knew. He knew that the seat was empty not because it had been closed, but because it was waiting. And the one who would sit in it would not open a door, but a lock. Kan Yi-chol finished his tea. His hand did not tremble. He had waited 72 years for this day. The fishermen in Haegu that evening said the water near the shore had grown hot, for the first time in living memory, and that at night the sea glowed, pale, green, as if someone had lit a lantern at the bottom. The 360th day. The Grand Hall of the Seven Seals Exchange, Sonryo. Jihwan stood at the entrance and counted his steps to the chair. 32. A year ago, he'd taken 32 steps in the other direction, toward the door, when the doorman had shoved him in the back. The hall was packed. Every merchant, every shopkeeper, every head of a house, every captain, every money changer on the entire continent of Cheonghae had come to watch. The standing room was packed. The balconies were bursting at the seams. On the first balcony stood the cousins of the Seo family. In-ho was first. The scar on his eyebrow from his uncle's ring had turned white, but hadn't healed. He stood straight. His face was pale. His hands rested on the railing. He wasn't smiling. The others stood beside him, 4 of them. The very same ones who had roared with laughter when the scoreboard showed a 1. Now, no one was laughing. The Council of 7 sat at a long table made of black wood. 7 chairs. The 7 heads of the great guilds. Salt, grain, silk, iron, slaves, opium, insurance. Each with a TR7. Their faces were impassive. Their eyes were heavy. They ruled the continent and they knew it. The 8th chair stood at the end of the table. Slightly to the side, wooden. No cushion, no inlay. 200 years older than the other 7. A symbol was carved into the armrest. The 8th seal. The seal of the guardian, which no one had touched in 200 years. A layer of dust a finger's width thick lay on the seat. Kan Yi-chol stood at the podium, 72 years old. His back was straight as a mast. His voice was steady as a ledger. He announced the agenda. 1 item. The only one. The approval of the 8th member of the Seven Seals Exchange Council. The candidate. Seo Jihwan. TR7. Manager of Haegu Port. The hall began to murmur. 1,000 voices. A rumble like the surf. Han raised his hand. Silence fell instantly. He said that voting would begin after hearing from both sides, and that the prosecutor would speak first. So Gyeongsu rose from the front row, TR6. He walked slowly toward the podium. Each step was measured. But Jihwan saw what others did not. His uncle had aged. Gray temples, a tremor in his right hand, which he hid behind his back. Bags under his eyes the color of old parchment. A year. Over the course of that year, his uncle had lost 3 contracts, 2 allies,
An entire shipment when Beachway intercepted his caravan from the Northern Principality through fair competition. They'd offered the client a price 5% lower. The client walked away. Silently. Without an apology. Jeonsu wasn't dead, but he was dying. Slowly. A liang a day. And he knew it. His voice was firm. Professional. He knew how to speak before an audience. 20 years as head of the house had taught him that. He read out the charges. 4 counts. First, Seo Jihwan forged the Seo house's ancestral seal to obtain illegal authority. Second, he stole the house's assets through fraud. Third, he formed an alliance with the Black Tide pirate clan to intimidate merchants and force them into an insurance pool. Fourth, he introduced an illegal system of warehouse receipts without the exchange's approval, thereby undermining the 7 guilds' monopoly on trade operations. And finally, he is an imposter.
Not the head of the trading house, not the heir. A manager, appointed by decree, accountable. He has no right to the chair because the chair is for leaders, not for servants. The hall listened. Jeonsu spoke for 20 minutes. Every accusation was well thought out. Every one sounded weighty. Every one was backed by the scrolls he placed on the table one after another. Evidence. Or what he called evidence. Cousin In-ho, on the balcony, straightened his shoulders slightly. Next to him, one of his cousins swallowed hard. Maybe all is not lost. Maybe the boy won't make it. Maybe the scoreboard will go back to 1. Jeonsu finished. He bowed to the council. He returned to his seat. Han Yui-chol asked if there was a response from the candidate. Silence. The hall turned toward the entrance. The doors were open. Sunlight streamed through the opening, and a silhouette stood in the backlight. One person. Jihwan entered the hall. A black hanbok. Plain. Without embroidery. No family crests. No coats of arms. His hands were empty. No scrolls. No weapons. No retinue. No one followed him. Unbo remained outside. Bikhui as well. Yirin too. He entered alone because a year ago he had left alone. And because this hall had to see him. A single boy. 32 steps. From the door to the chair. He walked, and every step echoed off the stone floor. The merchants in the front rows recoiled. Not out of fear. Out of something else. Out of the silence that walked with him. Dense. Heavy. Like the calm before a storm. He did not approach the podium. He stopped in the middle of the hall, facing the council, with his back to his uncle, and silently placed the first object on the council table. The ancestral seal of House Seo, the genuine one. A bronze plate the size of a palm, bearing the house's coat of arms, the founder's name, an engraved pattern found on no other seal on the continent, the very one his uncle had lost a year ago, the one he'd been searching for, the one he'd blamed his nephew for losing, the one he'd found. Unbo. 2 weeks ago, an old servant arrived in Sonryo. He entered the empty study of Jihwan's late father. He found a hiding place behind the mirror, the one known only to 2 people, father and son. My uncle didn't know, because my father had made the hiding place. For his son, 20 years ago, just in case, for this very occasion, as if he'd known. The seal lay on the council table. Han Yui-chol looked at it, then at Jihwan. The 7 guild leaders watched. The hall watched. Gyeongsu watched. Jihwan placed his finger on the seal. 1 ryang. An eye. Activation. The seal flared. Not crimson like a year ago when it tore his name from him. Gold. Bright. Pure. Warm. The hall gasped. 1,000 voices at once. The ancestral seal recognized the blood. It either accepted or rejected. There was no third option. It accepted Jihwan. Heir. Direct. Legitimate. The only one. The golden light faded. The hall fell silent. A sound came from behind Jihwan. A step backward. His uncle. His legitimacy as head of the Seo house had just evaporated. Not before an official. Not before a court. Before the Council of 7.
before the exchange, before the entire continent, before 1,000 witnesses who would tell 10,000 more tomorrow. Jihwan placed a second item on the table. Not just one, 7. 7 scrolls. He unrolled them one by one, slowly, letting everyone see. The Seo House's debt obligations, to each of the 7 guilds. He had been buying them up for half a year, quietly, patiently, through Pei Sogol on the Sanrio black market, through merchants from the insurance pool who had access to the guild archives, through Yorin, who traveled the continent like a shadow and tracked down every promissory note, every loan, every receipt, every contract bearing So Gyung-soo's signature, every debt, every ryang. 7 scrolls, 7 guilds. The total amount, 420,000 ryang. The Seo household owed 420,000 to different people, to different households, to different guilds. And all these debts, every single one, down to the very last ryang, now belonged to one man, Seo Jihwan. He hadn't bought the Seo family, he'd bought its debts, which is the same thing, because whoever owns the debt owns the debtor. The hall was silent. So silent that you could hear one of the cousins on the balcony stop breathing. The Seo family belonged to the nephew, in its entirety, down to the last cup. Gyung-soo stood there. He looked at the scrolls. His expression didn't change. For a second, 2, 3. Then it changed. Slowly, like melting wax. His lips twitched. His eyes widened. The hands he'd been hiding behind his back came forward and hung limply. He fell to his knees. Not because he wanted to, because his legs could no longer hold him up. The stone floor was cold beneath his knees. He uttered a single word. Quietly, almost a whisper. Nephew. Then 2 more. Have mercy. I'm your uncle. The hall held its breath. Jihwan stood and looked at his uncle. A year. 360 days. He remembered every one. He remembered tea with honey. He remembered the scroll knife between 2 contracts. He remembered how the seal flared scarlet and the numbers rolled downward. 4, 3, 2, 1. He remembered his cousin's laughter. He remembered the doorman's hand on his shoulder. He remembered the rain on the streets of Sanrio and the 12 leon in his wallet. He remembered the wet road to Haegu. He remembered the rotten fish. He remembered the first night when he boiled salt by the campfire and his nose bled from the eye. He remembered Yorin's face when she handed him a bowl of rice. He remembered Beachway on the deck of the first junk. He remembered Unbo, who had followed him in silence for 3 weeks through the rain and never once asked where he was going. He remembered everything. And he looked at his uncle, calmly, without hatred, without triumph, without pity. He took a cup from his bosom, a porcelain one, a small one, with a thin crack running across the entire bottom. That very one. He'd brought it back from Haegu. He'd carried it in his hands for the last 3 days of the journey. He didn't trust the pack sacks. He was afraid of breaking it. He took out a flask, poured some tea, honey and ginger, warm, sweet. The scent wafted through the room. That very scent. Childhood, illness, mom's hands, and betrayal, all in one cup. He set it down in front of his uncle, on the floor, on the cold stone. He said quietly, so that only the front rows could hear, "Finish it, uncle. You deserve it." The hall held its breath. Gyung-soo stared at the cup. His hands were shaking. He recognized it. A crack running across the bottom. He'd taken it out of the cupboard himself a year ago, poured the tea himself, slipped in the scroll himself, smiled himself. He took the cup with both hands, brought it to his lips. The tea was sweet, just like back then. He drank it all. He set the cup on the floor, quietly, steadily, right in the center, just like Jihwan had done a year ago. The tea wasn't poisoned.
Poison is for those who lack the seal.
And the clan seal had already recognized Jihwan as the heir. And Gyeongsu became a usurper. By the law of the clan, by the law of blood, by the law of the seal. A usurper was stripped of protection. The seal on Gyeongsu's chest flared scarlet, the very same scarlet that had burned on Jihwan's seal a year ago. Gyeongsu clutched his chest. Not poison, not pain. Worse. Emptiness. The very same emptiness that Jihwan had felt a year ago. The seal was letting go of the health it had bestowed upon the clan leader. Strength. Years. 20 years of illegitimate leadership. 20 years of living someone else's life. Gyeongsu's hair turned white. Before the eyes of the entire hall, second by second, his skin tightened. Wrinkles spread like cracks in parched earth. His back hunched, his hands withered. He hadn't died. But the man kneeling before the cracked cup was no longer Seo Gyeongsu, head of the TR6 household. He was an old man, broken, withered, empty. TR0, lower than a beggar, lower than an orphan, lower than a dock worker. 0. On the balcony, Inho sat down, slowly, as if someone had pulled the bones out of him. The others sat down beside him, wax figures, motionless,
With identical faces. The hall was silent. Han Ui-chul waited for a pause, a long one. Then he stood up and announced the Council of Seven's vote on the approval of the 8th seat. The head of the Salt Guild. In favor. The head of the Grain Guild. In favor. The head of the Silk Guild. A pause. A long one. He looked at Jihwan, at the boy who had outbid his supplier and broken the blockade in 10 days. In favor. The head of the Iron Guild. In favor. The head of the Slave Guild. Against. The head of the Opium Guild. Against. The head of the Insurance Guild. Abstained. 4 in favor, 2 against, 1 abstained. Kan Yi-chol turned to face the chamber. His voice was steady. The 8th seat on the Council of the Seven Seals Exchange is occupied by Seo Jihwan, TR8. The chamber exhaled. 1,000 people at once, as one. Jihwan approached the chair. 200 years of dust. He didn't bother to wipe it off. He sat down. The dust rose in a cloud and settled on his black hanbok. The chair was wooden, stiff, cold, uncomfortable, perfect. His hand rested on the armrest, on the carved symbol, the 8th seal, the seal of the guardian. He didn't activate the eye. The eye activated on its own, without a command, without silver, without restrictions. Golden light flooded his pupils, and for a single second, the entire hall saw it. The boy's eyes were ablaze. Gold. Like coins. Like the sun on water. Like something ancient and immense that had been slumbering inside him for 200 years. The light faded. A second. In that very second, the floor of the hall trembled. Once. The walls hummed. The cups on the council table bounced. Twice. Stronger. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Stone grit. Old plaster. 3 times. Even stronger. Someone in the hall screamed. Someone fell off a chair. Han Ui-chul grabbed the edge of the table and stood. Steady. Like a mast. He didn't scream. He knew. The hall door flew open. Princess Yun So-hwa rushed in. Pale. Road mud on her white hanbok. Her hair disheveled. She had ridden 3 horses non-stop on the road from Haegu. A 3-day journey covered in 1.5 days. She ran to the council table and stopped in front of D. Jihwan. She was gasping for breath. Her hands were shaking. She said, "Sonim, Haegu. The sea has receded 3 li from the shore. The seabed is exposed. The fishermen can see it on the seabed." She fell silent. She swallowed. Then she finished. "Something is rising." The hall fell silent. The silence was so profound that one could hear the wind outside the window whipping dust across the Sunrio Bridge. Han Yuichal turned pale for the first time in 50 years. He looked at the chair, at the carved seal beneath Jihwan's hand, at the golden glint deep within his pupils, and he realized what he had suspected for 30 years. The chair was not just a chair. The council was not just the council. The exchange was not just the exchange. All of it, the entire system. Trade, the guilds, the seals, silver, ships. Everything was part of something bigger. A castle. One that Li Zhenghe had built 200 years ago. And the key to that castle had just sat down in the chair and placed his hand on the seal. Jihwan slowly stood up. The exchange's eye operated on its own, without any effort. The feed unfolded before his eyes, but there were no prices on it, no goods, no routes. There were numbers. A countdown. 47, 46, 45. Second by second, day after day. To what end? He did not know, but he saw. Far to the south, beyond the horizon, beyond 3 layers of bare seabed,
in the depths of which there was no longer any. A shadow, the size of an island. It was moving, slowly, upward. He turned toward the council. 7 faces, pale, frightened, confused. 7 heads of the guilds who ruled the continent and did not know they were ruling a prison. 7 guardians who did not know they were guardians. Their greed had fueled the seal for 200 years. Their trade had kept the castle standing. Their silver flowed through the veins of the system and kept it from stopping. And now the system had cracked, because the 8th guardian had returned. Because Li Zhenghe's blood had awakened. Because the boy with 12 lians had reached the 8th. And the seal at the bottom had heard. Jihwan spoke calmly, in an even voice, without a hint of a tremor, without any grandstanding, in the same voice he'd used a year ago to tell his uncle that he would buy this hall and sell it off piece by piece. Members of the council, congratulations. You have just chosen the 8th guardian, and it seems we're all exactly 200 years too late. The hall fell silent. The dust settled. Outside the windows of Sonryo, in the southern sky toward Haegu, the horizon trembled, slowly, heavily, as if the sea had sighed. The stock exchange display above the hall's entrance flickered. The number next to Seo Jihwan's name updated. 8. The first 8 in 200 years. The temple clerk who was making the entries dropped his brush onto the floor. The ink smudged across the parchment register. He did not wipe it away. He just stared at the number. 8. At that very moment in Haegu Bay, Ma Jung-sun stood on the deck of the last keel, her hands on the rail, the wind in her gray hair. She looked at the exposed bottom of the bay where there had been water just that morning. Sand, rocks, dead coral, seashells, and beyond, at the very edge of her vision. Movement, enormous, slow. A shadow rising from the depths like an island emerging from the sea. The wood of the ship's side beneath her hands was warm, for the first time in 200 years. She closed her eyes. She whispered. He sat down in the chair. The seal heard her. Now it would all begin. Bichve stood nearby, her hand on the hilt of her sword. She looked at the shadow in the empty cove and felt no fear. She feared something else. That the boy she'd known for 6 months, for whom she'd brave any storm, would turn out to be something greater than she could comprehend. Something that didn't belong to her, not to Hague, not to the continent, but to the sea. Yoren stood on the pier with a small board in her hands, the last column of the daily report. Income, expenses, profit, balance. The numbers were accurate, as always. The world could be shaking, the sea could recede, shadows could rise from the depths, millennia-old seals could crack and burn. But the numbers were accurate. And as long as they were accurate, as long as he was counting,
as long as she was counting beside him. As long as his brush rested evenly on the slate and the ink didn't smudge, everything would be all right. Jorn closed the slate, pressed it to her chest, and waited.